Today's story is incredibly disturbing, so viewer and listener discretion is heavily advised. I'm warning you now, this is a paranormal story unlike anything you've ever heard. It is incredibly violent, it is incredibly gruesome, it involves murder, and more. So, take that as a warning. In the rural quiet of Warren, Massachusetts, where the land stretches out in endless fields under gray skies that seem to press down like a shroud, Maurice Theriault lived a life of simple, unyielding labor as a devout Catholic farmer. Born and raised in the shadow of the church bells that tolled every Sunday, Maurice had always found solace in the rhythms of the seasons, planting seeds in spring and harvesting under the autumn moon, his hands roughened by the earth that sustained him and his family. Maurice, often known by his nickname Frenchie, was born into a harsh and impoverished family in French Canada during the early 20th century, where rural life on the farm demanded unrelenting labor and work from even the youngest children and families. Maurice's father, Maxime Theriault, was a domineering and malevolent figure who ruled the family's household with an iron fist. He was a man who viewed his son not as a child, not as his own kid, but only as an extension of the farm's workforce. From a very, very young age, Maurice was forced by his father to work long, grueling hours on the farm, and in fact, he was pulled from school after graduating the 3rd grade so that he could work more and toil endlessly on the family farmland. That's right, his own father wouldn't even allow young Maurice to graduate from grade school, yet alone high school or, God forbid, college.
He would be working in Maine with his father. That's what he was forced to do. He was forced to work on the farm. Maurice was a normal kid to a certain extent.
Out of 3rd grade in school, made to do like everything farm-wise, all the house chores, take care of all the other siblings in the house.
Before he was even 10 years old, Maurice was performing back-breaking tasks on the family's farm, like plowing fields, tending to livestock, and harvesting crops that far exceeded what a young boy his age's fragile body could endure. The physical demands of working on the family farm left young Maurice exhausted and malnourished, with little time left in his day for play or education. This rough, physically and mentally abusive childhood fostered a deep-seated resentment and fear towards his father within Maurice. He hated his dad, and at the same time, he was deeply afraid of him. But even Maurice's time spent in school before he was pulled out to work at the farm was marked by turmoil. Bullied by his friends and peers in the sparse school years he did experience, Maurice often retreated into isolation, finding solace only in whispered prayers to a God he hoped would deliver him from his tormentors. These early experiences scarred him profoundly, instilling a sense of vulnerability that would echo throughout the rest of his life. As Maurice navigated his preteen years, the abuse at the family home escalated beyond mere overwork, delving into the realms of psychological and possibly physical and sexual cruelty that blurred the lines of familial duty. His father, described by Maurice in later reflections as a man frequently consumed by rage and unexplained obsessions, frequently lashed out at Maurice with verbal tirades and physical punishments for the slightest perceived infraction. But one particularly traumatic incident, recounted in harrowing, extreme detail during investigations into his later life, would go on to scar young Maurice forever. On this particular instance, in the year 1936, it was a late summer evening on the farm. Everyone had wound down for the evening, Maurice had finished with his daily work, and he had been sent to the barn to fetch a tool for something that needed to be done in or near the family home. But as Maurice was wandering across the property, he began to hear noises and movement from inside the barn, and at first he couldn't believe his ears. What he was hearing seemed to be a mix of human grunting and animalistic, guttural screeches. Whatever the noise was, it echoed with a sense of pure evil, and Maurice was both terrified and curious, and so, slowly step by step, he inched towards the barn, wanting to find out what was happening within. Slowly, Maurice creaked open the door to the structure and snuck inside. The air inside of the barn was thick with the scent of hay and animal musk, the only light filtering through cracks in the wooden walls. A light which cast elongated shadows across the floors and walls that danced like specters across the stalls. However, these strange, muffled grunts seemed to be coming from the opposite side of the barn, and so, through the shadows, Maurice crept. As he passed by the stalls holding livestock, he noticed that the animals themselves seemed to be on edge. They stared at him with frightened, anxiety-ridden eyes, and shifted nervously. Something was deeply wrong, but Maurice could never have possibly been prepared for what he was about to see. As he finally reached the corner, Maurice hid himself amongst the hay and wood beams, and finally looked into the stall where the noises were coming from. And what he saw was a horror far beyond human comprehension. According to Maurice, inside of the stall was his father, Maxime, who loomed over a large, terrified pig, his shadowy form silhouetted against the faint glow of a lantern that had haphazardly been hung from a nearby beam. But his father wasn't tending to the animal. According to Maurice, Maurice Theriault was brutally the pig with a fiendish pleasure, while at the same time muttering and mumbling blasphemous, demonic-sounding phrases. What Maurice was witnessing with his own two eyes was an inhuman abomination. His own father engaged in a grotesque act of thrusting against the frightened animal with a feral intensity that blurred the line between man and beast, the poor sow's desperate squeals piercing the air like cries of violation. Frozen in horror, Maurice's heart pounded in his chest, his small hands clutching the rough edge of a stall door, the metallic tang of fear filling his mouth as he realized the depth of his father's depravity. This was no mere farmhand's madness. It seemed to be a ritualistic defilement, whispered in family lore as being a dark pact with unseen forces. And in that moment, Maurice's innocence cracked like brittle ice underfoot. In the book Satan's Harvest, written about this case, this moment is described as follows, quote, "The boy froze, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, unable to comprehend the abomination before him. The sow squealed in terror and pain, its body thrashing against the ropes that bound it to a crude altar of hay bales arranged in a circle on the dirt floor. Maxime had etched symbols into the ground with a knife, crude pentagrams and inverted crosses, surrounding the scene like a profane temple. He chanted in a mix of French and what sounded like ancient Latin, words Maurice later recognized from forbidden church tales as summons to demonic forces. The act was no random perversion. It was a satanic rite, a desperate bargain with the devil to ensure the farm's fertility after years of failed crops and dying livestock. Blood from a small cut on Maxime's palm dripped onto the pig's flank, sealing the pact as he thrust with savage intensity, his eyes rolling back in ecstasy or trance. Before Maurice could slip away, his father sensed his presence, whirling around with a snarl that echoed like a beast's growl. Grabbing the boy by the collar, Maxime dragged him into the circle, the lantern light casting demonic shadows on the barn walls. "You see now, boy," he hissed, his breath reeking of whiskey and sulfur. "This is how we feed the hunger of the land. The devil demands sacrifice, and this is ours." Terrified, Maurice begged for mercy, but Maxime forced him to kneel beside the sow, pressing his small hands against the animal's trembling side. Under threats of eternal curse and physical beating, the father compelled his son to participate, guiding Maurice's trembling form to mimic the profane union, whispering that this initiation would bind him to the family's dark legacy. The violation was brief but searing, the boy's mind fracturing under the weight of shame, the sow's cries mingling with his own stifled sobs as thunder cracked outside. End quote. In layman's terms, having been caught in the act of spying by his father's sharp, predatory senses, Maurice had been given no time to flee before Maxime's massive hand clamped him around his slender arm like a vice and yanked him into the foul circle of light with a growl that reverberated through the barn's rafters. The boy's pleas fell on deaf ears as Maxime, eyes wild with a mix of rage and unholy fervor, forced Maurice to his knees beside the trembling animal, the ground damp and sticky beneath him from spilled feed and worse. With threats of unspeakable punishment and those oaths sworn on the devil's name, Maxime then forced his son to participate in the pressing his kid's face close to the sow's flank, demanding that he touch and engage in the union under duress. the animal's panicked struggles only heightening the terror as its body heaved against them both. That's right. According to Maurice, his own father forced him to join in on this ritual, forced him to this pig right in front of him. Maurice's mind reeled in disgust and shame, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face, his small body shaking as he complied out of sheer survival instinct. The violation was not just physical, but spiritual as well, as Maxime continued muttering demonic-sounding incantations in a bastardized French that invoked dark entities, binding Maurice in a web of complicity that would haunt his mind and prayers for years. As the lantern flickered low, casting their twisted forms in hellish relief, the boy felt a piece of himself die, right there within the low light of the barn. As the last rays of the setting sun bled away into the encroaching night of that late summer evening, Maurice was left alone, huddled in the corner of the barn, the pig's labored breathing a ragged accompaniment to his own horrified sobs, the forced bestiality etching an indelible mark of trauma that would fester like an open wound through his adolescence and the rest of his life. In the book Satan's Harvest, it's stated that, quote, "When it was over, Maxime released him with a warning. Speak of this to no one, or the demons will claim your soul before dawn." Maurice stumbled back to the house, the taste of bile in his mouth, scrubbing himself furiously in the dark kitchen while his mother, Emila, pretended not to notice his distress. That night, as rain lashed the roof, the boy prayed desperately to God for forgiveness, clutching his rosary until his knuckles whitened. But in his dreams, the barn replayed endlessly, the pig's eyes accusing him, Maxime's laughter morphing into whispers from the shadows. The Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, later interpreted this as the moment the demonic entity latched onto Maurice, the ritual's energy marking him as a vessel, inherited from generations of Theriault pacts with Satan to combat poverty and misfortune on their cursed Quebec farm, end quote.
Maurice, by all accounts, had been an abused child by his father. His father was a maniac, and he would beat him, verbally abuse him. He forced Maurice to have sex with animals, and Maurice, loved his mother very much, and the father was incredibly abusive to Maurice's mother as well.
According to Maurice's recollections shared during interviews with investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren later on in his life, the event was tied to long-standing family lore of dark pacts and curses that had plagued the Theriault lineage for generations. According to Maurice, it seemed like the family had been cursed for decades, centuries. He'd always heard in his youth stories of older generations performing satanic rites or dark rituals, but he had never seen hard evidence himself until that very night, when he was forced into performing in a ritual himself. Maxime, Maurice's father, seemed to believe that by performing this profane union, defiling an animal in a ritualistic manner, he could invoke demonic entities to grant him power, prosperity for the farm, and dominion over the land's hardships. The act was conducted in secrecy within the barn, accompanied by those muttered incantations that invoked unseen forces or the devil himself, framing this entire thing as a sacrificial offering to seal a supernatural bargain. This satanic element is emphasized throughout the narrative of the case as being the potential origin point of the curse that later transferred to Maurice, marking him with a spiritual vulnerability from a young age and contributing to the alleged demonic infestation that haunted his adult life. But this was no random ritual. This wasn't something that Maurice's father just invented himself. According to some researchers and some discourse online, this form of worship or ritual may have been somewhat common amongst rural farms in French Canada at the time. In fact, the ritualistic nature of Maxime's actions is further contextualized in the book Satan's Harvest as potentially being an extension of rural occult traditions in early 20th century Quebec, where impoverished farmers sometimes turned to forbidden lore for desperate aid against famine, poor harvests, or their own personal failures. During the specific incident with Maurice, Maxime reportedly prepared the sow, a female pig, in a makeshift altar within the barn, surrounding it with those crude symbols etched into the dirt floor, symbols like inverted crosses or pentagrams, and chanting phrases that blasphemed Catholic saints while committing the act. This was not impulsive lust, but a calculated desecration, intended to feed the demonic realm with taboo sin, thereby earning favor from Satan in exchange for worldly gains that never actually fully materialized for the family. The book's authors, drawing from the Warrens' investigation and Maurice's hypnotic regressions, that this event bound a malevolent spirit or negative energy to the Theriault bloodline, with the pig symbolizing the harvest's corruption, turning sustenance into something profane and accursed. Lorraine herself later sensed residual black energy from this trauma during her sessions with Maurice and interpreted this event as having been the devil's entry point for further possessions. While the book presents this as unequivocally satanic and ritualistic, which to some individuals is up for debate, it also notes the psychological toll on young Maurice, who was forced to witness and partially participate in this disturbing act, which only deepened his already present sense of inherited damnation. No contemporary records or external corroboration exist beyond Maurice's testimony, but the narrative ties it directly to the farm's haunted history, suggesting that Maurice's father, Maxime's motivations stemmed from a mix of genuine belief in occult efficacy and his own fractured psyche, possibly exacerbated by alcoholism or the isolation of the farm. And the act's satanic intent is supposedly reinforced by subsequent misfortunes that were experienced by the family on their farm: recurring crop failures, mysterious animal deaths, and Maurice's early brushes with the paranormal, which the Warrens attributed to the unbroken pact. In essence, yes, if what Maurice stated was indeed true, what this was a bona fide ritual with explicit satanic undertones, designed to serve as a sort of barter with infernal forces, and it served as a foundational trauma that echoed through Maurice's life until his eventual exorcisms in 1985. By his early adolescence, Maurice's childhood had transformed him into a resilient yet haunted young man, drifting through the rigid structures of farm life while harboring unspoken traumas that isolated him from his parents, his siblings, and his community. The constant physical and mental abuse that his father imposed upon Maurice while at the family farm further eroded his trust in authority figures, particularly his father, whom he viewed as a harbinger of evil rather than a protector. Bullied relentlessly at school before his abrupt departure, Maurice had already internalized a sense of otherness, and often took time to wander the vast, unforgiving Canadian landscapes alone, where the wind seemed to carry whispers of escape. It was only when Maurice was alone when he truly felt at peace. Family dynamics at the time were strained as well. While his mother, Emila, offered fleeting moments of tenderness amidst the chaos, she was powerless against Maxime's tyranny, which left Maurice to navigate a world where love felt conditional and incredibly rare. These years caused Maurice to begin viewing his Catholic faith as a shield, with rosary beads clutched in calloused hands during stolen moments of prayer. Yet they also sowed doubts about divine justice. Why would God allow such suffering for the innocent? Why was God putting him through this horrific chapter of life? What was God's plan in all of this? And in many cases, Maurice asked himself in moments of conflict, is God dead? Is God even real? This internal conflict would later manifest in his adult life, as the family's isolation only amplified the echoes of his father's enduring cruelty. The culmination of Maurice's childhood came as he entered his teenage years, marked by a desperate bid for personal independence that propelled him away from the toxic homestead towards New England, but not without lasting psychological imprints. The obscene barn incident lingered like a shadow, fueling nightmares in Maurice's mind and a morbid fascination with the occult that his father had inadvertently introduced him to. Physically, the grueling labor had built him into a sturdy, muscular young man, but emotionally he was completely absent. Maurice never received help with his declining mental condition. He had no one to talk to about it, and he was forced to remain silent, trapped within the confines of his own mind. However, according to Maurice, he would occasionally experience miracles, when the prayers for his salvation were sometimes seemingly answered. He later recounted stories of times when, after praying, he would be given bursts of inexplicable strength, which allowed him to move heavy loads that other grown men found impossible to carry. According to Maurice, these prayers would also be answered in different ways. Sometimes they would even give him mental fortitude and strength to survive his father's intense beatings, sometimes without experiencing any pain. For a while, Maurice and those around him believed him to have been one of God's chosen ones. However, this couldn't have been further from the truth. You see, according to Maurice, this gift came with an unseen price, an eerie sense of being watched or doubled, as if his pleas and prayers had invited unseen observers who lurked in the shadows of the barn or the darkened corners of his room, staring at him with an icy coldness. The work that Maurice was forced to complete on the farm only intensified during wartime shortages during World War II, with Maurice being forced to haul timber outdoors through biting winters and powerful blizzards, his body aching from the dawn to dusk toil that left him collapsed in exhaustion. But when Maurice would crumple to the floor, unable to work anymore, his father would hit and kick him, forcing him up onto his feet so that he could work more, his eyes gleaming with the same feral intensity that Maurice had seen on that fateful evening with the pig in the barn. Family tensions amongst the Theriaults boiled over in silent standoffs, and his mother, Emila's attempts to shield Maurice from the beatings only sparked Maxime's fury, one time culminating in a beating that left Maurice bedridden for days, his bruises seemingly a map of inherited damnation. It was around this time as well, like I said before, that Maurice began to report feeling a paranormal presence around him and around the family farm. Tools would go missing from places where Maurice knew he had placed them, only to reappear in the same spot days or weeks later. And occasionally, while he was walking or working alone, an icy cold chill would creep across Maurice's body, accompanied by a grotesque scent of sulfur or decay. Maurice at the time dismissed these incidents as nothing more than guilt-induced hallucinations, but the Warrens later on attributed these events to the ritual's residual energy, as demonic forces slowly latched onto Maurice's vulnerable soul. Throughout his teenage years, Maurice's father, Maxime's control over him tightened like a noose, and he denied Maurice the chance to work anywhere other than on the family farm, and he also prevented him from making new friends or seeing old ones. And the work Maurice was forced to complete on the farm grew increasingly grueling, and included tasks like mending fences in the dead of night under moonlit skies, during which, on at least one reported instance, the apparitions of twisted animal forms taunted Maurice from the shadows, which frightened him to his core. These visual apparitions seemed to represent the psychological echoes of Maurice's trauma, blending with emerging poltergeist-like disturbances that rattled tools and doors without cause. Emila, Maurice's mother, frail from years of abuse that she herself had also suffered at the hands of Maxime, became Maurice's sole confidant, and with him she shared tearful stories of ancestral pacts that explained Maxime's madness. Emila begged Maurice to seek absolution through confession, though church visits only heightened his alienation, as he felt that the priest's gaze stared deeply into his unspoken sin and trauma that he refused to confess to. Maurice's attempts at teenage rebellion, like sneaking away to nearby towns to work odd jobs, or even going on a date with a local girl, were met with savage reprisals. Maxime once locked Maurice in the root cellar overnight, where he reported that the darkness amplified his visions of horned figures, demanding loyalty to the family's dark legacy. Yearning for escape, Maurice fantasized about fleeing Canada and moving to the United States, confiding in no one as the weight of secrecy eroded his faith, prayers turning from pleas for protection to bargains with whatever force might grant him freedom from the devil's harvest sown in his youth. By the time that he finally left home, Maurice carried the weight of unspoken sins, a fractured self-image, and a resolve to build a better life, unaware, however, that the demons of his youth, literal and metaphorical, would pursue him across borders. Eventually, he was able to muster up the strength to break the cycle of abuse, and he moved himself to the United States, where he settled in Massachusetts, hoping for a brand new start to a brand new chapter of his brand new life. And indeed, Maurice's migration to Massachusetts did represent a fresh start, but the roots of his troubled psyche, nurtured in abuse and isolation, ensured that the harvest of his past would one day reap a terrifying toll. It was the spring of 1946 when Maurice was 19 years old when he finally left Quebec and crossed the border into Vermont with nothing but a small bundle of clothes, a rosary, and a burning determination to forge a new life free from his father's abusive shadow. Haunted by the ritualistic horrors of his childhood, Maurice hitchhiked southward, his sturdy frame, honed by years of brutal labor, carrying him through the unfamiliar landscapes of New England with a mix of trepidation and hope. He settled initially in Worcester, Massachusetts, a bustling industrial city where French-Canadian immigrants like him found work in the textile mills, operating massive looms that clattered day and night like the chains of his past. The transition was harsh. The air reeked of dye and machine oil, a far cry from the clean, earthy scents of Quebec fields, and Maurice boarded initially in cramped tenements with other laborers, sharing small, meager meals and stories of home with the others in hushed Acadian French. Yet, this new beginning offered a fragile peace. and allowed Maurice to attend Mass regularly at St. John's Church, where the familiar rituals of his Catholic faith provided the first true solace he had known, whispering promises of redemption amid the grind of 12-hour workdays. For the first time, Maurice felt the weight of the Theriault curse lifting slightly, though nightmares of the barn and his father's incantations still occasionally jolted him awake in the dead of night, reminding him that some shadows follow across borders. By 1950, Maurice's life in Worcester had stabilized into a routine of mill work and quiet devotion, but it was at a parish social hosted by St. John's Church that he first encountered Nancy, a kind-hearted young woman of Irish descent whose warm smile pierced the armor he had built around his soul. The event that they attended was a simple harvest dance in the church hall, alive with accordion music and the scent of fresh-baked pies, where Maurice, ever the outsider with his heavy accent and reticent demeanor, lingered on the fringes of the room, nursing a cup of coffee. Nancy, then 22 years old and working as a seamstress in a local factory, noticed Maurice immediately, his broad shoulders and earnest eyes standing out amongst the crowd, and struck up a conversation with him about their shared faith, which drew him into a discussion of saints and family traditions that eased his heart. Over the following months, Nancy and Maurice courted modestly under the watchful eyes of the church community, strolling through the city parks where Maurice tentatively shared fragments of his Quebec hardships, obviously omitting and skipping over the darkest secrets, while Nancy's gentle encouragement and unwavering piety began to heal the fractures left by his adolescence. The couple's bond deepened through shared masses and volunteer work at the parish, with Maurice finding in her a partner who mirrored his devotion to God, a beacon against the lingering guilt that plagued him. In the autumn of 1951, they married in a quiet ceremony at St. John's Church, vowing before the altar to build a life rooted in faith and family, a union that promised to break the cycle of his inherited torment. The early years of the couple's marriage were marked by joyful anticipation and the rapid expansion of their family, beginning with the birth of their first child, a son named Paul, in the summer of 1952 at Worcester City Hospital, where Nancy labored through a difficult delivery that tested their young faith, but ended with cries of new life filling the room. Maurice, pacing the halls with a rosary in hand, felt a profound miracle in the moment that he first held his son in his arms, and he couldn't help but cry. As he looked down at his newborn baby, all he could think about was the fact that the innocent face evoked a purity he had long lost. And at that point, Maurice vowed silently to forever protect this child from the dark, demonic, traumatic shadows of his past. Just 15 months later, in October 1953, Maurice and Nancy's daughter Marie arrived, a delicate infant whose baptism at St. John's became a celebration of God's grace. Amidst their modest circumstances, with Maurice working double shifts at the time to provide for the growing household. Nancy's resilience shone through these births, her home filled with the scent of nursing and lullabies sung in French and English, while Maurice's pride swelled, seeing in his children a fresh harvest untainted by the devil's bargains of his youth. The couple's devotion deepened with each sacrament, the parish priest blessing the family as a testament to perseverance, though Maurice occasionally still woke from dreams of Quebec, whispering prayers over the cribs to ward off any encroaching darkness. By 1955, twins Robert and Claire were born in a single exhausting event that brought their family to 4 children, the hospital room echoing with Nancy's exhausted relief and Maurice's tearful gratitude, solidifying their bond as parents in the face of mounting responsibilities. As their family continued to grow, the birth of their 5th child, a daughter named Anne, in the spring of 1957, completed the Theriault household, arriving just as Maurice secured a better position managing a small dairy farm on the outskirts of Worcester, a step toward the rural life he knew but now envisioned without the curses. Nancy, ever the pillar, managed the chaos of 5 young ones with a blend of stern love and Catholic discipline, the home alive daily with children's laughter and the daily recitations of grace that anchored them against life's uncertainties. Maurice, completely transformed by fatherhood, poured his energy into providing stability for the family, teaching children farm chores and the importance of prayer and hard work, determined to shield them from the occult whispers that haunted his past. At one point, the family moved to a modest farmhouse in Warren, Massachusetts in the year 1960, and this marked a pivotal shift, where the open fields evoked both nostalgia and weariness. But the births had forged an unbreakable unit in the family, with each child a living rebuke to the satanic legacy of Maurice's Quebec roots. Nancy's unwavering support through these years, from midnight child feedings to communal rosaries, turned their home into a sanctuary of faith, where Maurice finally began to believe that God's mercy could outshine the devil's harvest sown in his bloodline. Though Maurice continued to experience some of those unexplained, frightening omens, like feeling cold spots or seeing fleeting shadows in the corners of his vision, the joy of their growing family and the new life that he had made for himself provided a bulwark, allowing Maurice to embrace his role as husband and father with a renewed sense of purpose. Yet, in the winter of 1984, as snow blanketed the ground in a deceptive peace, the first cracks began to appear in this idyllic existence. Signs that were subtle as first, like whispers in the wind that carried an unnatural chill. In the winter of 1984, Maurice began to notice his cows behaving oddly. He suddenly found himself awakened in the middle of the night, over and over, to the sounds of the cows screeching and yelling, and as he listened, their lowing turned to distressed bellows that echoed through the night, stirring him from sleep with a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. It seemed like something was out there amongst the herd, frightening them, moving amongst them with a calculated, evil precision. And to Maurice, it felt almost as if whatever was bothering the cows was watching the house from afar. At first, he dismissed these repeated nighttime disturbances as being nothing but the cold bothering the animals, but deep in his gut, a knot formed, the kind that foretells storms far worse than any New England blizzard. As the days lengthened into the bitter cold of January 1985, the disturbances on the farm escalated into something profoundly disturbing, targeting the animals with a ferocity that defied natural explanation. On one particularly disturbing morning, Maurice rose before dawn to tend to his daily chores and check in on his beloved livestock. However, as he slowly approached the barn, he felt something in his heart, a sudden pang of anxiety that sent a recoil throughout his body. Even though he didn't know what it was, he knew that something was wrong. Slowly, he approached the old rickety structure and pushed open the doors, which creaked with a slow, agonizing evil. And to his absolute horror, 3 of his best cows were lying dead in the barn, their bodies contorted in agony, their eyes bulging, almost popping out of their sockets, and blood oozing from their ears, noses, and mouths in thick, dark streams that had pooled on the hay-strewn floor. Seeing this, Maurice couldn't breathe. His greatest fears had come true. It, whatever it was, had found him. After taking a moment to process what he was looking at, Maurice knelt beside the cows on the ground, his breath catching in his throat, feeling the warmth already fleeing their massive forms. But he couldn't help but notice something absolutely disturbing. As he looked over the bodies of his cows, he noticed that their hides had been marred by deep, bloody scratches that looked like claw marks from some sort of beast not of this world. The veterinarian arrived later that day, his face paling as he examined the carcasses, unable to find any disease or injury that could cause such hemorrhaging, muttering about poison or infection, but shaking his head in confusion. Maurice's heart, throughout this veterinarian's visit, pounded with a mix of grief and fear, the loss hitting him like a physical blow, as these cows were the backbone of his livelihood, their milk the sustenance for his family. Nancy watched on from the doorway of the farmhouse as the doctor and her husband examined the dead animals, her rosary clutched inside of her white-knuckled hands, as she whispered prayers that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Over the next week, more cows on Maurice's farm fell victim to the same gruesome fate, their deaths coming suddenly during the night, accompanied by unearthly screams that woke the entire household, leaving Maurice staring into the darkness, wondering if the devil himself had come to claim his harvest. The barn, once a place of comfort, now felt oppressive, shadows lengthening unnaturally even in the daylight, as if the very walls absorbed the light and exhaled malice. It was at around this time when Maurice also really began to feel watched, a pricking at the back of his neck when he was alone with the remaining livestock, their eyes reflecting a terror that mirrored his own growing unease. In moments when he was alone, sitting with himself, Maurice would feel a presence, sometimes in the house, sometimes in the fields, sometimes in the barn. However, Maurice stated that at around this time, it began to feel as if he were never truly alone. Something was always there with him, in the corners of the room, watching his every move. The Theriault children, at around this time, began to ask their parents hard questions. Why does Dad seem so scared? What's happening to the cows? Are we safe in our house at night? But unfortunately, the two parents didn't have any answers. By late January of 1985, the horror began to infiltrate the Theriault home itself, transforming the warm hearth into a stage for poltergeist fury that built suspense like the slow boil of a pot ready to overflow. Pots and pans began to rattle in the kitchen cabinets without cause, clanging against the wood as if shaken by furious, invisible hands, startling Nancy as she prepared dinner, her knife slipping from her grasp in fright. On one particularly violent evening, the Theriault family sat at the table eating dinner. After prayers had ended and the children had dug into their food, a strange energy entered the room. The hair stood up on Maurice's body as he felt a phantom energy ripple across his person. Suddenly, as the entire family watched on in horror, a heavy skillet was lifted from the stove by a phantom hand. The lifting of the pan was slow and methodical, and what the family was witnessing was impossible to comprehend. The skillet was slowly rising into the air as if guided by an invisible hand, fully levitating by itself. And suddenly, the pan was violently thrown through the air, embedding itself in the wall only inches from Maurice's head, the impact sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The children screamed and dove under the table, while Nancy crossed herself repeatedly, her voice trembling as she called upon St. Michael to protect the family. Maurice, his face ashen, pried the skillet free from the wall, his hands shaking, feeling an icy draft sweep through the room despite the closed windows, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell of sulfur that burned his nostrils. The energy, or the spirit, or the demon, had just tried to kill him. Or did it? Maybe it was more intent on making Maurice suffer. Maybe it was trying to force him into a full-on mental, physical, psychological breakdown so that his body would be easier to enter and possess. Regardless though, the family was forced to carry on with their lives as normal amidst the escalating horrors, unable to move out of the house due to their financial situation. But things would only get worse. Nights spent in the Theriault home became a torment, with doors slamming shut on their own, footsteps creaking on the stairs when everyone was in bed, and shadows flitting across the walls in shapes that twisted into leering faces before vanishing. Every night, Maurice lay awake, listening to the occasional unnatural sound, his mind racing with memories of old folk tales his grandmother told, of spirits that were angered by the living. But he pushed them away, clinging to rationality, even as fear gnawed at his resolve. The occurrences over time grew bolder, with furniture shifting and sliding across rooms with scraping noises that echoed like bones rattling in a grave, right before the family's very eyes, leaving both the children and parents in a state of constant shock and vigilance, jumping at every creak, afraid of what might happen next. At this time, Maurice began to suffer from health conditions. He would seize up and shake at night, gripped by some sort of unexplainable ancient force, and seizures became commonplace in the house. But the haunting escalated dramatically one day with a discovery made by Nancy Theriault. As the author of Satan's Harvest describes, quote, "One morning, Nancy entered the bedroom to find her cherished Bible, always kept on the nightstand beside their bed, defaced beyond recognition. The leather cover bore deep claw-like scratches, as if raked by an unseen beast, and the pages were torn to shreds, scattered across the floor in a chaotic heap. Some pages were smeared with a dark, foul-smelling substance that resembled dried blood, while others bore inverted crosses etched into the paper with what appeared to be a sharp instrument. The sight sent a shiver down her spine, and she crossed herself instinctively, her voice trembling as she called for Maurice, who was still recovering from a violent seizure the previous night. Maurice's sleep, when it came, was plagued by dreams of dark figures circling the farm, their whispers promising ruin, nightmares which would wake him in cold sweats with a taste of ash or sulfur in his mouth. But there was nothing the family could do. They didn't have the means or the money to run, and so they became trapped inside of an ever-evolving haunting, caused by a malicious energy intent on ruin and full physical possession. The poltergeist activity inside the Theriault family home intensified in early February 1985, turning the farmhouse into a labyrinth of terror. At all times of the day and night, lights in the home flickered on and off at will, plunging the house at random into strobing darkness that made simple tasks like walking to the bathroom a harrowing ordeal for family members, as they all reported seeing shadows lunging like predators in the intermittent glow. One night, as Maurice attempted to calm the children after a day filled with bizarre paranormal occurrences, a chair in the living room overturned violently and skid across the floor towards him with enough force to bruise his shins when he dodged it. After the chair was thrown at Maurice, the air inside of the room suddenly dropped in temperature and grew heavy and oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself was actively conspiring against the family, with frost blooming on windows, according to the kids, from the inside. Everyone inside of the room then huddled together, absolutely terrified at the possibility of what could possibly come next. This thing had thrown a chair at Maurice and had plunged the home into an icy hellscape, and it had turned off all the lights by itself. What could possibly happen next? Thinking fast, Nancy lit candles for light and warmth, but to the family's horror, after being lit, they all watched as each candle was blown out by a phantom gust of air, with the demonic energy blowing out the candles in a line, one by one, extinguished by breaths not their own, leaving the family in pitch blackness broken only by the distant howl of wind that sounded to them like mocking laughter. Maurice felt a growing rage within him, not his own, bubbling up like bile, making his hands clench into fists as blasphemous words formed on his tongue unbidden. The children, who huddled together, terrified on the living room couch, reported seeing apparitions, tall shadow figures peering through the windows and dancing on the walls, their faces distorted in grotesque grins that sent the young ones into a spiral of tears and terror. Seeing all this happening, Nancy began to cross herself and pray, but it did no good. Every time a candle was lit by a family member, it was almost immediately extinguished by the breath of the demon, which left in its wake a slight smell of sulfur. And while Nancy prayed over the room, the family members reported hearing a disturbing, distorted laughter echo from the corners, as if the entity was making fun of their attempts at spiritual protection. As the book Satan's Harvest states, quote, "As the disturbances grew more frequent and menacing, Maurice, driven by a desperate need to protect his family, took to boarding up the windows of the farmhouse with heavy planks of wood he salvaged from the barn. This came after several nights of the children reporting sightings of tall, shadowy figures with glowing eyes peering through the glass, their faces distorted in grotesque grins that lingered even after the curtains were drawn. Nancy pleaded with him to seek help, but Maurice, his hands trembling from exhaustion and fear, nailed the boards in place, the hammer strikes echoing through the silent house like a funeral dirge. The act offered little comfort, however, as the scratching sounds began almost immediately, nails raking against the wood from the outside, a relentless rhythm that suggested something was trying to claw its way in. At the same time that all of this incredibly intense paranormal phenomena was manifesting in and around the farmhouse, the physical torment of Maurice Theriault began, the body betraying him in ways that chilled his blood more than any spectral event, which marked, according to some, the onset of a full-on demonic possession. One morning, Maurice awoke in his bed to a burning sensation rippling across his chest. Believing he was suffering from some sort of medical emergency, he ran into the bathroom and switched on the lights so that he could see what was happening. But when he took a look at himself in the dirty bathroom mirror, his jaw dropped. Blood-red welts had formed across his chest during the night, red lines of raised flesh that formed an upside-down cross that burned like fire when he touched them. The skin around the welts blistered and hot. Nancy gasped at the sight and tried to apply a medicinal salve to the wounds that sizzled upon contact. However, although they tried to remedy the pain, the marks on Maurice's body only deepened, pulsing with a life of their own as Maurice winced in pain. During the days, Maurice began to even more frequently experience sudden seizures, his body convulsing on the kitchen floor, limbs flailing with unnatural strength that, during one particularly violent episode, splintered a chair when he struck it. Maurice's voice would change during these episodes, dropping to a guttural growl as he spoke in languages he apparently didn't know. Latin phrases cursing God, spat with pure verbal venom that made Nancy recoil in horror. Her husband was day by day becoming practically unrecognizable, a shell of himself, an empty husk of a human that seemed to glow with an impossibly violent evil. During these episodes, the children, terrified, would hide in their rooms, occasionally peeking their heads out into the hallway only to see their father arching his back impossibly, vertebrae cracking audibly, his eyes rolling back to show whites veined with red. His body contorted into an evil arch, twisting into foreign shapes that looked to be incredibly painful and at the same time, almost impossible. Maurice, in his lucid moments, which became more and more infrequent, begged for forgiveness from God, convinced that the sins of his past had brought this fate upon him. But even though he begged the heavens for help, the possession episodes grew longer, leaving him exhausted, sick, beaten, and bruised. One afternoon, while milking the family's last cow, the entity having killed off all the others, Maurice reported feeling an overwhelming hatred surge through him. This hatred filled up his entire body and his vision, and he watched in horror as he raised his fist in the air, his hand shaking with anger and violence. He was about to start beating the animal he loved dearly to death, and was stopped only when Nancy's cry pulled him back and awoke him from his hateful stupor. The possession was taking hold, twisting his faith into doubt, his prayers turning into screams in the night. The house echoed with his torment, each convulsion of Maurice's body a thunderclap of dread that reverberated through the walls. As February 1985 pressed on, Maurice's symptoms escalated into full-blown manifestations of demonic control. During these seizures that Maurice would experience, according to the testimony of his children and wife, he would begin to levitate, his body rising inches off the ground, sheets tangling around him like restraints from hell as he thrashed midair with inhuman strength and movements. Blood would begin to trickle from Maurice's nose and ears without cause, staining his clothing in patterns like upside-down crosses and pentagrams that mocked sacred symbols. The metallic tang mixing with the ever-present sulfur to create a nauseating experience for the other family members' senses. During one violent seizure, when Maurice began to lift off the ground, Nancy attempted to hold him down to keep him grounded, but his arms flung her across the room, her head striking against the wall with a thud that drew blood from her scalp. And this is also when one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, in my opinion, began. It was in early 1985 when Maurice's children reported witnessing him vomit up various substances and items, typically nails and shards of glass, sharp objects that were expelled from his mouth without any injury, clattering to the floor like cursed talismans. This, according to family members, happened multiple times. Maurice's skin would also blister at the touch of holy water, which Nancy sprinkled in desperation, the liquid hissing like acid on his flesh, leaving raw, weeping sores. During these seizures, or rather periods of possession, Maurice's eyes began to glow with an inner red light, his pupils dilating to black voids that seemed to suck in the light itself, as he stared at his family with a hatred not his own. He spoke of visions, horned entities promising power if he surrendered, their voices slithering in his mind like serpents. The pain was constant now, headaches pounding like hammers from within, his bones aching. Maurice's faith wavered, but he clung to it, whispering Hail Marys between gasps, even as the demon mocked him using his own voice. The culmination of Maurice's initial descent came in mid-February 1985, when fear for his family's safety drove him to the brink, the possession's grip so tight that it forced unthinkable actions. Overwhelmed by rages not his own, Maurice gathered his rifles and hunting guns, the tools typically used by a farmer to protect his family and his flock, and he drove himself down to the Warren Police Department, his hands trembling on the wheel as dark thoughts whispered of violence against Nancy and the kids. This haunting, or attempted possession really, had reached a breaking point, and the demonic entity was constantly telling Maurice, according to his own words, that he needed to hurt or kill his wife and children. After arriving at the police station, Maurice surrendered the weapons to the desk sergeant, his voice breaking as he explained that when someone else took over, he might kill those he loved most, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. And obviously, to the officers at the station, this was an absolutely frightening sequence of events, but a sequence of events that was recorded in official police records. This man had just entered the station, relinquished his weapons, and had told them that an evil force was telling him to murder his wife and kids. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, as they were both familiar with Maurice and knew him to be an honest, salt-of-the-earth man, but his words reeked of some sort of madness, or even a deeply troubling undiagnosed mental illness. However, the look in Maurice's eyes, according to the officers on duty, held such an honest terror that they later stated that they accepted Maurice's guns without question and let him go. And so, having turned over the weaponry, Maurice got back into his car and headed home. Back at the farm that night, the entity seemed to revel in Maurice's humiliation. Almost immediately after walking back through the house's door, household objects were violently thrown at Maurice by phantom hands, a lamp shattering against the doorframe right as he entered. Nancy, believing that Maurice had done a brave thing, the right thing, embraced him with a large hug, tears streaming down her face. But even then, mid-hug, his body stiffened, a growl escaping his lips as the possession surged, forcing him to shove her away with a violent push that would leave bruises on her body. The children, sensing the dark shift in their father's demeanor, then retreated back to their bedrooms, and the house immediately fell into a tense, penetrating silence, broken only by Maurice's labored breathing as he sat alone in the main living room. That night, the attacks intensified, and Nancy and the kids, too afraid to check in on Maurice, only heard the sounds of what was happening. The The sounds of Maurice's body slamming against the walls without cause, bones jarring and seemingly cracking with each violent impact. It sounded to them like Maurice was either running at the walls of their home at full speed and purposefully slamming his body into them, or like something was physically picking him up off the ground and slamming him against each surface. The next day, when Maurice awoke and the children and Nancy emerged from their rooms, they found that his body was covered in bruises that bloomed like dark omens. Maurice clawed at his own arms, drawing blood in deep furrows, the wounds healing slowly only to reopen with fresh agony. And the suspense of what the spirit or demon would demand next hung heavy in the home, Maurice praying for deliverance as the dawn broke cold and unforgiving that day. Days after surrendering the rifles, the horror reached a grotesque peak in the Theriault bathroom, where Maurice's possession manifested in a scene of pure, bone-chilling terror that would scar all those who witnessed it. And this is very interesting, because this actual event itself was written down and recorded by a Warren Police Department chief. So you have an actual, legal, official piece of police paperwork that exists. Not only the records from when Maurice surrendered his guns, but this is an actual document providing a narrative of what happened in this instance, written by a powerful person within the local police department who, has to swear that this is accurate and that this is true. On that evening, the Warren Police Department received a frantic 911 call from Nancy Theriault, who reported witnessing something so violent, so grotesque, that the police were required immediately. Wanting to handle the situation with care, and knowing that Maurice had recently turned in his weapons at the station, Police Chief Sean LaBouffe decided to handle the call himself, and arrived at the farm just minutes after receiving Nancy's frantic call. The scene that Police Chief LaBouffe would walk in on, however, was something straight out of a nightmare. After entering the farmhouse, Chief LaBouffe turned down the hallway and walked into one of the house's bathrooms, where Nancy was desperately screaming for help. Upon entering the bathroom, Police Chief LaBouffe observed Maurice, the honest farmer, lying on the bathroom's blood-spattered tile, his body gyrating back and forth like a top in uncontrollable spasms, his limbs twisting at impossible angles. Blood seeped from Maurice's eyes in thin rivulets, tracing crimson paths down his cheeks like tears from hell, while he babbled to the police chief in a strange language that no one in the home understood. LaBouffe, a man himself hardened by years of service in the police department, thought at first that Maurice was faking this behavior. This to him seemed like something that only happened in Hollywood movies, like in The Exorcist, which had come out about 10 years prior. He also thought to himself that this might be some sort of medical emergency with a practical, rational explanation. However, the sight of the crimson lines on Maurice's back, which formed right before his very eyes, the form of an inverted cross, dispelled any doubt in LaBouffe, as the wounds that he watched appear on Maurice's back were fresh and oozing with blood, as if carved by invisible claws while he was physically there in the room. To the police chief's horror, he then watched as Maurice's back arched to an inhuman degree, his screams a mix of pain and rage, the air thick with the sulfur that made the chief's eyes water. Nancy hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her face a mask of despair as she recounted the escalating events to the chief, attempting to explain what he was looking at, her voice breaking with every word. And this was the chief's last straw. Attempting to take control of the situation, as he could clearly see that Nancy and the kids were afraid, Chief LaBouffe attempted to restrain Maurice, but it was to no avail. Suddenly, Maurice was overcome with a reportedly superhuman strength, and he flung the burly police chief off of him with ease, sending LaBouffe hurtling towards the sink where he crashed in pain. As the police chief sat stunned and in shock, Maurice slowly rose up from the ground in a demonic pose, his eyes locking on LaBouffe with a gaze that, according to later accounts from LaBouffe and the police report itself, pierced his soul and filled him with an inhuman sense of dread and terror. The incident, which lasted only minutes, felt like hours, the bathroom a chamber of horrors where rationality fled, leaving only primal fear in its wake. When it was over, Maurice collapsed to the floor, weeping and confused, the cross on his back a mocking stigmata that burned when the chief touched it. LaBouffe then fled the property shaken, and made a formal police report discussing what he had just witnessed, his report detailing the unnatural events in detail, which would eventually serve as a physical, official notation and recognition of these events, as the chief knew and wrote down that this didn't seem to be an ordinary crisis. In the wake of the bathroom ordeal, Maurice's possession deepened, turning every moment into a suspenseful wait for the next assault, the entity toying with him like a cat with a wounded mouse. He experienced visions of deceased relatives, their faces twisted in agony, beckoning him to join them in the shadows beyond the farm, their skeletal hands reaching through the walls. During meals, he would suddenly seize, and his family would watch as the fork that he held in his hand was bent with force that warped metal, food flying from his plate as if it were picked up and thrown by an unseen entity. Nancy's attempts to pray over Maurice triggered violent reactions, his body convulsing, foam flecking his lips with a bitter black substance that smelled of decay. The children all saw him levitate fully one evening, his body rigidly hovering above the bed, twisting into blasphemous poses that mocked the crucifix on the wall. Whispers at times filled the Theriault home, constant and insidious, revealing family secrets in a voice not Maurice's, eroding the family's trust and filling the air with paranoia. Maurice's skin began to itch constantly, as if insects crawled beneath, which led him to begin scratching himself until his flesh peeled away in strips, blood trickling down his arms and legs, staining his clothing. Obviously, sleep evaded Maurice, replaced by nightmares where he was harvested like his dead cows, his soul reaped by scythe-wielding shadows and demonic forms. And even the farm and the property itself felt cursed, like the land was rejecting the family. The crops would wither overnight and die on their own accord despite the winter dormancy, and Maurice's faith, once his anchor, now felt like a chain pulling him toward the abyss with every unanswered prayer. The unrelenting phenomena also isolated the Theriault family, as rumors of devilry and demonic possession spread like a plague through the town of Warren, heightening the suspense of their solitary battle against the unseen. Rumors began to circulate that Maurice was possessed, or that the devil lived on the Theriault farm. So, people stayed as far away as they could from the family and from the property itself. This, though, only caused the family to become more isolated. Maurice took to wandering the fields of his farm alone at dusk, drawn by what he described as an irresistible pull, where apparitions of horned figures appeared to him amidst the barren trees, their laughter a low rumble that vibrated in his bones. After these solo walks around the farm property, Maurice would return with even more marks burned or scratched into his body, pentagrams at times etched into his arms by his own nails, the wounds flowing with a foul pus that attracted flies, even in the dead of winter. The family was at their wits' end. Afraid of what might come with the night, Nancy herself began barricading the farmhouse's doors when the sun set, but it was to no avail, as the family reported instances like one time when the entity breached the barricaded doors with phantom force, causing the front door to burst open with a gale-force wind, even though it wasn't windy outside, snow swirling in the house like uninvited demonic guests. According to the kids, their toys started moving on their own, dolls' heads turning to stare at them with blank eyes that seemed alive with malice, their toys whispering them taunts in tiny little voices. Maurice's voice began to split during conversations with the family members, alternating between his own pleas for deliverance and spiritual safety and demonic snarls denouncing all that he and the family held sacred. Blood began appearing on the walls, dripping in words of Latin that translated to curses against God, the letters forming and dissolving like living ink. And Maurice, well, he grew strong. His newfound superhuman strength, which came across him during bouts of possession, manifested in events like him destroying large pieces of household furniture with his bare hands, wood splintering as if it was struck by an axe, which, in at least one instance, left the family's living room in ruins. The sulfur smell clung to Maurice now, a personal brand that made Nancy weep when she embraced him. Even when she hugged her husband and tried to snap him out of the possession stupor that he was in, he reeked of sulfur and rotting flesh. This wasn't her husband anymore. It was someone or something else. The possession's grip was absolute, Maurice a vessel for horror, his every breath a struggle against the darkness within. And as that month wore on, Maurice's body became a canvas for the demonic artist's gruesome work, with anti-religious stigmata appearing and disappearing spontaneously, nails driven through his palms in illusionary pain that drew real blood. He screamed through the night, his cries echoing across the barren, snow-covered fields surrounding the farmhouse, neighbors drawing curtains against the inhuman sounds and screams that chilled their blood. During one episode, Maurice gnawed at his own arm, teeth sinking violently into his flesh until Nancy pulled him away, the bite marks deep, and shortly afterwards, infected. Visions of sacrifices, both human and animal, plagued Maurice, ancient rites on the farm's soil replaying in his mind, blood of animals and men mingling in satanic ritual circles. The entity, according to the family, demanded obedience and verbally promised relief to Maurice if he renounced his faith in God, the temptation a siren call amid the torment. On another occasion, Maurice's eyes wept blood again, staining the pillow of his bed in pools that formed symbols of inverted crosses. The family, desperate for some sort of solution but unable to come up with any real answers, prayed together, but the words twisted in Maurice's mouth from prayer to blasphemy, his laughter joining the demons in unholy harmony as he attempted to interrupt verbally the family's prayer. Inside of the house, the family began to report feeling and hearing cold winds which howled from inside the home, even when no doors or windows were open. A wind so strong that it extinguished fires and froze the rooms, with icicles forming on the ceilings indoors. Maurice felt his soul slipping away, fragments torn in the seizures, leaving voids filled with rage. And the physical toll on his body mounted, his once sturdy frame wasting away, skin sallow and eyes sunken as the possession drained him like a vampire's kiss. According to the family, he began vomiting up random objects almost daily. One time he vomited rosary beads, another time shards of bone, each expulsion a retch of agony that left him curled on the floor, weeping for deliverance from God. Nancy's care for Maurice was constant, but even she was assaulted, in one instance reporting feeling invisible hands choking her until bruises ringed her neck like a necklace from hell. The children suffered endless nightmares, waking to find their beds levitated, their sheets twisted into knots, feeling like they were being watched from every corner of the room. And Maurice's knowledge expanded unnaturally, as he began to speak of hidden family sins in ancient tongues, revealing dark truths that horrified Nancy. Obviously, Nancy had never been told about what had happened to Maurice in the barn with his father so many decades ago, but the demon told her all about it and spared no detail. This disturbed her to her core. The barn, the site of the first deaths of those poor cows, became forbidden, as the shadows there coalesced into forms that lunged at Maurice, or any of the other family members when they approached. Eventually, this all became too much for Maurice, and his prayers to God for salvation turned instead to verbal pleas for death, as he begged for God to just kill him and end the pain too great, but the entity denied even that mercy, prolonging the torment and purposefully keeping him alive, never harming him enough to take or end his life.
Maurice was a good man when Maurice was Maurice. But when Maurice came under possession by the demonic, he had very strange powers. He began to have strange things happen. He could bilocate, which means that he could be in two places at one time. We know that through bilocation, it can come about from the divine, as in the case of men like Padre Pio, a man who lived during our lifetime, or it could come about through the demonic. In Maurice's case, it did.
My father, he got scared himself and didn't know what was going on. He first went to the police. They told him, "You're not." After things started to get worse, then he called the priest.
The house groaned night after night as if itself was alive, beams cracking under invisible weight, whispers echoing from every corner. And the family, trapped in the home by their financial situation, had nowhere to run, had nowhere to go, didn't know what to do. They were all trapped there, on edge at every moment, just waiting for what was to come next. And Maurice's world narrowed only to survival, and his faith became his only weapon, although very weak, in the gathering darkness. In the depths of his affliction, Maurice reported experiencing auditory hallucinations, like voices in his head that commanded acts of desecration that tested his will to the point of breaking. During one auditory hallucination, Maurice heard and told his wife the name of the demon, Zephin, a fallen angel hungry for souls, promising eternal power in exchange for spiritual surrender. And the demon who was attempting to fully possess Maurice began to manifest in more extreme, even more disturbing ways. During the coming trances or seizures, Maurice's body would begin to contort into animal shapes. He would rise up off the ground, thrash and scream, and then unnaturally contort until he ended up on all fours, panting and growling like an animal. Then, he would chase after his family members on all fours, screaming and clawing and growling as if he himself were a rabid animal that wanted to kill them. Blood that spilled from Maurice's mouth formed words on the floor, specifically over and over again the word mine, which repeated over and over in a looping script that left a plume of smoke upon drying. Nancy burned sage and brought holy relics in and out of the home, but the smoke twisted into mocking faces before dissipating. The children drew crosses on their doors with chalk, but in the morning, they would discover that the marks had bled red overnight. Maurice's newfound superhuman strength allowed him to bend iron pokers in front of the family, the metal glowing hot in his hands without burning him. Visions of the farm's past flooded Maurice. Witches' covens in the 1800s, blood rites binding spirits to the land. The entity revealed itself in mirrors, his reflection grinning independently, teeth sharpening to fangs. That's just absolutely disturbing sounding. As a side note, Maurice would be staring at himself in the mirror and report watching his reflection suddenly grow sharp teeth and smile at him, even though he wasn't smiling. Out of all this stuff, that definitely is one of the things that gives me a chill. And each of Maurice's senses came under assault. Tastes turned to ash in Maurice's mouth, making it hard for him to even eat meals, and the water that he tried to drink turned bitter with brimstone, forcing him to spit out liquids in disgust. Sounds amplified, the tick of the clock sounding like thunder, whispers building to roars that felt like they burst Maurice's eardrums in phantom pain. Touch became torment, with Maurice reporting that wearing clothing felt like being bound and weighed down by heavy chains, his skin crawling with unseen vermin. His sight distorted, and Maurice reported seeing the walls breathing, figures in every corner, and smells of rot and sulfur permeated everything, a constant reminder of the corruption. At this point in the possession, Nancy's embraces burned Maurice, her touch triggering convulsions that flung her away and sent Maurice running off to a corner. The children avoided their father, their eyes filled with pity and fear, whispering things like "Daddy's gone." Maurice begged his family for isolation and ended up locking himself in the basement, but the entity followed him down there, pipes around him rattling like chains, the darkness alive with glowing eyes and shadow figures. The suspense of possession's endgame loomed, the entity savoring Maurice's slow, horrific breakdown. Maurice's spiritual torment peaked as the demon mocked his Catholic roots, twisting sacraments into parodies that desecrated the soul. Holy water, right in front of the family's eyes, boiled in the font in their home, steam rising with hisses of rage when Maurice approached. The crucifix above his bed inverted, and the nails dripped blood that spelled out the words "false god" on the wall. Prayers were recited backwards from Maurice's lips, each Ave Maria a curse that filled the room with black smoke. Visions of hellfire consumed him, flames licking his skin in illusory burns that blistered his flesh in real life. Nancy's Bible pages flipped themselves to apocalyptic verses, the words themselves bleeding ink. The entity boasted of legions, promising to harvest the family's souls one by one. Maurice's confession attempts failed, words garbling into lies that shamed him, and the church bells in town that they could hear from the farmhouse tolled mockingly, their sound warping in Maurice's ears into laughter. Faith became a battlefield, the possession a siege on Maurice's eternal soul, and this only got worse and worse and worse. If you think that this couldn't possibly get any worse, well then boy do I have some news for you. You have to keep in mind that this was all occurring over the period of a few months in the beginning of 1985. The Theriault farmhouse had turned from a sanctuary to an absolute spiritual battleground. The family didn't have the money to move, and the patriarch in the family just wasn't there. Most of the time, he was being afflicted by this thing, this demon, whatever you want to call it, so the entire family was lost, afraid, abused, and above all, terrified. Life in the home had turned into a horror movie, and survival at that point was all that filled Nancy and the children's minds. When was Daddy coming back? Was Daddy ever coming back? What is going on? As the possession solidified, Maurice's behavior devolved into graphic acts of He would frequently cut or injure himself and proceed to attempt to paint the house in a coating of his own blood. On one instance, he attempted to gouge his own eyes out with his fingers. He wasn't successful, but tears of blood did flow from his eyes afterwards that cascaded down his cheeks like waterfalls of sorrow. Maurice bit his nails down to the cuticles, then tore through the flesh on his fingers until in at least one instance, bone showed, the pain and distraction from the unrelenting mental agony. While cursing God and speaking in that demonic form of faith, Maurice's tongue would swell to an unholy proportion, and suddenly he would bite down on his tongue, causing blood to pour from his mouth out onto the ground or table as he spewed profanities in tongues unknown. The entity even began to take control of Maurice's mind, force him to grab a knife or other sharp object and carve symbols into his own body. Symbols that he carved upon his own body while in these trances, the knife moving with a demonic precision. Nancy, afraid, would nurse the wounds and bandage Maurice up, but the cloths and bandages would unravel by themselves, wounds reopening to ooze ichor that stank of grave dirt. The children one time found Maurice, their father, in the yard, rolling in mud that he had apparently mixed with fresh animal blood, howling at the moon like a beast. The entity delighted in the spectacle, laughter booming from Maurice's chest. Maurice's reflections, according to anecdotal evidence, in water even began to show a grotesque, twisted version of himself, complete with horns and fangs, a preview of the monster he was becoming. And the entity's taunts even grew personal, tormenting the entire family. At one point, during a trance-like state, Maurice accused Nancy of infidelity in a voice not his own, with made-up details seeming intimate and painful. Nancy denied these charges and broke down crying, but it was to no avail. This wasn't Maurice talking to her anymore, it was someone else. To his eldest son, Maurice began to whisper of paternal failure, of how he had failed his son, how his son had turned out to be horrible and a failure himself, and how he was disappointed, which planted seeds of resentment that festered. Maurice would even speak to his youngest children, promising them toys and delights if they just got close to him. However, when the kids would approach, he would lash out to them with a mixture of demonic fury and violence, scaring them away back into their rooms. Family meals, which began to occur incredibly infrequently, became interrogations, with Maurice's eyes glazing as the demon probed the family's weaknesses and directly asked them about and called them out for their deepest insecurities. For brief, lucid moments, Maurice fought back against the demon and assured his family that he loved them and that this would all be over soon, apologizing profusely, but the damage inflicted upon the family members lingered like scars. The suspense of familial betrayal added layers to the terror, the entity weaving discord from pain. The possession isolated not just Maurice, but also the soul of the family. Interestingly, the family even reported experiencing bizarre paranormal environmental phenomena on the farm property that raged with an ancient sort of evil. At one point, it was reported that the trees on the property bent and snapped in violent winds that the nearby town of Warren or any neighbors failed to experience. The wells on the property at times bubbled with an overflowing black slime, rendering the water undrinkable. Animals that still remained on the property managed to escape, broke from their confines fleeing the barn, wild-eyed and foaming at the mouth. Even the ground, the dirt, the earth near the house began to crack, resulting in large fissures that exhaled cold air laced with sulfur. Maurice reported later on feeling pulled towards these cracks in the earth, compelled to peer into their dark, abyssal depths. Nancy sprinkled salt lines throughout the home and all across the property, but they vanished, replaced by footprints, cloven and smoking. The family even reported that the sky over the farm would darken unnaturally, storms brewing only above their land that never reached any other properties in the surrounding area. Lightning struck the farm's silo, splitting it in half without fire, the wood charred in what looked to be pentagram patterns. The land itself seemed possessed, echoing Maurice's internal war. But the family couldn't take it anymore. Nancy and the children were being tortured endlessly by not only Maurice, but also by the group of spirits and demons that surrounded him. And so, Nancy reached out to a local priest for help. As the book Satan's Harvest states, quote, in mid-February 1985, as Maurice's physical symptoms worsened, convulsions, aversion to holy objects, and guttural speech, Nancy Theriault, in a state of panic, summoned Father Homer Boyer to the farmhouse for an emergency blessing. Upon entering, the priest sprinkled holy water on Maurice, who recoiled violently as if burned, his flesh blistering red where the cold drops landed, accompanied by a scream that was more rage than pain. The room filled with a sulphurous stench, the crucifix on the wall twisted unnaturally, its silver gleaming with a mocking sheen. Father Boyer, a man of deep faith but limited experience with such phenomena, attempted to recite an exorcism prayer, but Maurice's body arched backward, vertebrae cracking audibly, and a voice not his own spat blasphemies in multiple languages. Shaken, Boyer retreated, his hands trembling as he blessed the family from a distance, advising Nancy to seek higher ecclesiastical authority, as he felt outmatched by the entity's power. End quote. As you can see, Nancy and the family attempted to get help, but even when a priest was sent out to aid them in their struggle, he was frightened to his core and suggested that he could do nothing for them. Call someone else, he said, essentially, I can't handle this one. The demon's too strong. But all the while, during this month or two, Maurice's condition and the family's torment grew worse and worse. His health deteriorated rapidly, turning the once robust farmer into a gaunt specter. His weight melted away, muscles atrophying despite Nancy's forced feedings, his frame skeletal under a thin layer of skin. Fevers raged throughout Maurice's body, and he would even enter coughing fits that brought up phlegm tinged with bloods, his lungs burning as if filled by embers. Maurice's hair fell out in clumps, his scalp itching with sores that wept yellow pus. His vision began to blur, colors leaching into grays, as if the entity was dimming and even stealing his sight, and even his hearing was affected, and he later stated that every sound he heard was like a needle to the brain, a whisper to a shout, a drop of the pin to a gunshot. Maurice's sense of taste and smell merged into one constant rot, and he began rejecting any food or liquid in violent heaves. Maurice himself had turned into a living corpse animated by darkness. And all the while, the demon's demands escalated, and the demon began to command Maurice to perform rituals that profaned his beliefs. When Maurice would refuse, he was met with escalating pain. The demon ordered Maurice to urinate on the altar cloth that Nancy kept in the home, and although Maurice fought back, something else took control of his body and forced him to. The act left him racked with guilt, and it left the altar cloth soaked in piss. Anytime the family would pray, Maurice would scream out blasphemies, even if he was in the other room, and the demon even forced him to draw symbols in blood on his children's doors, the knife trembling in his hand. Anytime Maurice would refuse to do the devil's work, seizures would take control of his body that lasted for hours, his body completely enmeshed in rigor, his jaw locked in silent screams. The entity relished in this unrelenting moral torment, whispering of damnation for compliance or resistance. And any time that Nancy tried to intervene, anytime she tried to touch or take care of or speak to her husband, the demon would take control of Maurice's body and use him to strike her with a closed fist. The psychological warfare was relentless, breaking the family down piece by piece. All the while, Maurice's soul screamed silently, trapped in a cage of rotting flesh. In moments of partial lucidity, Maurice documented his torment in a journal, the handwriting alternating between his neat script and scrawled demonic symbols, a record of the unfolding horror. He described the entity's origin, tied to the farm's history of occult pacts, witches soaked blood into the soil generations ago. In those moments of lucidity, he managed to scribble down lots of pertinent information, revealing names that the demon had told him, and even of satanic occult rites that had been performed long ago. One day, Nancy picked up this journal and began to read, and what she read was so disturbing, so horrifying, that it sent a paralyzing wave of fear and cold rippling throughout her body. She didn't know these names. She didn't know this history or about these rituals. So where was Maurice getting this information from? As she read through the journal, she noticed moments where the pen seemed to shake across the page, and she realized that these were seizures that interrupted the entries. While Maurice was writing, ink splattering like blood, pages tearing in fury. The journal became a talisman, hidden under Maurice and Nancy's mattress, consulted in quiet hours for sanity. But eventually, the demonic entity discovered the journal and set it on fire, burning it to nothing more than a pile of ash. Maurice then got himself a new journal and attempted to rewrite the entire thing from memory, in an act of defiance that earned him physical retribution from the demon. The narrative in the pages, however, built suspense in those who read it, as it not only spoke of the past, but also of disturbing events that were to come. Nancy, in moments where she was able to get a hold of the journal without Maurice around, copied down sections in her own handwriting and hid them throughout the house, fearing that the demon would burn Maurice's journal again, her own hand shaking while she scribbled. The written word captured the bone-chilling progression of the possession, a testament to the endurance of the family, and would eventually provide physical written evidence of the demonic infestation that investigators like the Warrens would use to get a greater understanding of just what was infesting Maurice. But things were reaching a breaking point. One night, Maurice, in a possessed state, shattered a window of the house with his head, the glass embedding in his scalp, blood streaming down his face as he laughed and screamed maniacally. Nancy, once the demon had left Maurice's body, pulled the shards of glass out from his scalp one by one, but as she pulled the glass out, it kept cutting her hands. Her own blood then began mingling with Maurice's blood in some sort of perverse communion that the entity seemed to love. The entity boasted to the family that it had an unbreakable hold on Maurice and the entire family, and promised them endless nights of mental, physical, and psychological torture. Neighbors heard the crashes, the screaming, and the commotion on the farm, even from a distance away, but fear kept them away, as they themselves were frightened by what they heard was happening there. Maurice's dreams then began to merge with his waking life, as the entity took full control of his body, mind, and soul, the boundary between dream and reality dissolving in hallucinatory blurs that amplified the terror. Maurice dreamed of being bound in ritual circles, knives carving his flesh for harvest offerings. And after these dreams, he would wake up with real cuts and slices on his body. Apparitions visited, apparitions that described themselves as the past owners of the farm, their ghosts demanding that Maurice join them in their damned pact with the devil. The dreams foretold events and warned them of demonic activity, death, and suffering to come, building prophetic dread. When Maurice would have these nightmares, he would seize, and Nancy would attempt to shake him awake. But even after he woke up and opened his eyes, according to Maurice, the visions lingered, his eyes unfocused on phantoms. The entity used dreams to plant suggestions, compelling acts from Maurice upon waking. As you can see at this point, Maurice, according to himself and his family, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't sit down, couldn't rest, couldn't talk, and now he couldn't even think for himself. The horrors never slept, and it continued to get worse. That sulfur smell only got more powerful within the home and appeared more frequently. Nancy, when the scent would fill the home, would say a prayer and attempt to burn incense to mask it, but the stench overpowered, turning the incense smell into a smoke that reeked of burning flesh. The children, when these smells would fill the home, would begin to retch, and they were forced to abandon their meals as they couldn't stomach eating when the air reeked of death. Even the remaining animals on and around the farm property began to shun Maurice, seemingly sensing the fact that he was tainted by the devil. The auditory torment that Maurice and his family were facing eventually, according to them, evolved into full symphonies of damnation, with demonic choruses from hell screaming and singing demented songs directly into Maurice's ears, chanting tunes of otherworldly rites in unison. Whispers that the family heard in the home built up to demonic screams, which left their eardrums throbbing. The sounds at times even became localized, as footsteps circled the family's beds while they tried to sleep. Nancy heard echoes of demonic music at times as well, which to her confirmed that what Maurice was hearing was not really a delusion, it was real. Maurice even began to constantly plug his ears, sick of hearing these wretched noises, but the voices and noises persisted. His visual distortions also intensified at around this time, the world warping around him, everyday objects in the home elongating into claws in his warped vision, the faces of his children and wife melting into skulls. The shadows detached from the floors and walls and crawled around the house like spiders. Maurice even reported that everyday colors inverted and stated that all holy items in his vision turned pitch black, as if they were being erased from existence. When Maurice would look at his wife, Nancy, her face would morph to that of a snarling demon, which terrorized him and caused him to be unable to even look at his loved ones. Maurice became unable to eat, he became unable to drink water because he claimed that it felt like acid in his throat, and the entity even took control of Maurice and at one point forced him to consume dirt from the family farm property, which he would then vomit up onto the floor or table, black and filled with worms. Meals became torture, starvation threatening Maurice and his family's lives, and they couldn't take it anymore. But, as it turned out, help was on the way. Remember how I talked about the visit of Father Boyer to the Theriault farmhouse, during which holy water sizzled on Maurice's skin, a rotting stench filled the air, Maurice twisted up and growled, and the priest fled, unable to help? Well, recognizing the severity, and knowing that a police chief had also been out to the family property and was unable to help, Father Boyer reached out to Ed Lorraine Warren, a couple renowned for their work with the Catholic Church on possession cases, and sent them a detailed letter describing the phenomena that not only the police chief had witnessed, but that he had witnessed as well. Activity including poltergeist activity, stigmata, and xenoglossy. And along with his letter, Father Boyer also sent Police Chief LeBouff's official report.
We were contacted by a priest by the name of Father Homer Boyer in Warren, Massachusetts. He told us about this French-Canadian farmer, and he told us that the only way he really knew the family, although they were parishioners, but he said they were very private people. And he says, but some very strange things are happening. Father Homer Boyer had witnessed him levitate. He watched marks, writing on his body. He watched him bleed from no point of origin. And he also witnessed to the levitation and objects that would, well, kind of suspend themselves in the air. For instance, there was a brass tray with a tankard on it that would say maybe whole wine and little wine glasses, but they're very heavy. It's a very heavy thing. And it was suspended on a curtain rod. You couldn't do it. I mean, if you tried to do it,
This was a man of age who had seen many things in his life. He was in his 70s and was not prone to any type of panic or exaggeration or embellishment or anything. He was just a nice, holy, religious person.
He said, I go there from time to time. I pray with the family, but it seems to antagonize what is there. It really isn't helping. He said, so I know I need your help. At that first meeting, they talked about the levitation of things. They talked about the writing on Maurice's back. Messages would be written on his back as if by a very fine scalpel. The blood would come right through the t-shirt. But if you took that t-shirt off, the blood would dematerialize in front of you.
I do remember the first meeting because it left quite an impression on me. I've been involved in many cases, and I'm a hard sell because of being a law enforcement officer. One of the phenomenon that allegedly happens if a person can be possessed is incredible feats of strength.
He could lift an object as heavy as a 450-pound statue.
He had a statue that he said he got from a cemetery, and that's what it looked like. It was maybe 5.5 feet tall, concrete. I think it was a statue of St. Teresa, because it looked like it had roses in its hand, but the roses were broken, and that's why the statue was tossed out. So he had it, and it was solid concrete, and after calling on this entity or demon or whatever he allegedly had, he was able to pick this statue up with his fingertips, which was pretty incredible because I'm 6'2", 220, and back then I was in really good shape, and I could just about lift it up with a bear hug.
Movement of objects, sounds, bleeding from Maurice's eyes from no natural causes, crosses appearing on his body. State police were called in, local police. They found Maurice on the floor in the bathroom, and while there, they had seen phenomena occurring around Maurice, the bleeding from the mouth, the eyes, French-Canadian messages appearing on his back.
For us to say that this is a true case of demonic possession, we have to be able to document. It isn't just our word. We have to be able. We had him institutionalized for 30 days in a mental institution in Worcester, Mass. We had doctors evaluate him. We had to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to the police, to the doctors, to the priest, to the family, all of these people involved, that he was really under possession. I remember the doctors shaking their heads to us at a meeting and telling us there was nothing mentally wrong with this man, but they did say bizarre phenomena did surround him. When he went to the graveyard one day, the father's gravesite where the father was buried, and he knelt and he prayed in front of our researchers. He knelt and he prayed for his dad. Some invisible force came along, hit him right under the chin, so he went flying backward at the gravesite.
Even though it took a while for them to get the letter, after they had received it, the Warrens, based in nearby Connecticut, responded promptly. Interestingly, Lorraine Warren, upon receiving the letter, reported experiencing a clairvoyant vision of a black fog enveloping the farm, which, according to her, confirmed her belief that this was a significant case tied to historical occult activity on the property or within the family, likely the satanic rituals performed by Maurice's ancestors. Ed Warren, with his background as a demonologist, saw the combination of physical manifestations, like levitations and object throwing, and spiritual signs, like aversion to the sacred, as classic indicators of possession, prompting them to immediately travel to Warren, Massachusetts to try to help. The Warrens arrived at the farm under a sky bruised with storm clouds, their presence a beacon of hope amid the encroaching gloom. Lorraine, upon stepping onto the property, immediately sensed the oppressive weight of demonic energy, and described it once again as a black fog that clung to the buildings like a shroud woven from nightmares. She recoiled slightly upon arriving, her hand clutching Ed's arm as visions flooded her mind. Images of ritual sacrifices and ancient pacts made in the shadows of the farm's history. Maurice, upon seeing the Warrens on his property, flew into a rage, his body convulsing as if electrocuted, foaming at the mouth with a bile that hissed upon hitting the floor. The entity within him recognized the threat that the two posed, snarling through Maurice's lips in a voice that echoed with otherworldly depth, saying,
"You cannot cast me out. This vessel is mine."
Ed, undaunted by this declaration, immediately brandished his crucifix and began reciting prayers that caused the air to crackle with tension. The family's momentary relief upon seeing the arrival of the Warrens was then ultimately tempered by fear, knowing that the Warrens' involvement would unearth truths more horrifying than any they had yet faced. During their initial investigation, the Warrens allegedly documented a litany of phenomena that painted a picture of infernal infestation. The electronic equipment that they brought with them malfunctioned inexplicably. Their audio tape recorders captured voices that weren't heard while they were in the room, growls and speakers that spoke of eternal damnation in Latin and Aramaic. Lorraine eventually conducted a seance in the living room, and according to witnesses, the table levitated, slamming down with enough force to splinter the wood, while cold spots formed in the room, dropping the temperature to freezing amid the summer warmth. Maurice, bound to a chair for safety, and in the presence of the Warrens and other observers, then began to vomit up objects. A nail, a shard of glass, expelled from his mouth without gagging, each item clattering to the floor like omens of doom. The children recounted to the Warrens visions of a horned figure lurking in the corners of the house, its breath hot and fetid, filling the house with the stench of decay. Ed noticed the stigmata-like marks on Maurice's body, which appeared and vanished, bleeding profusely at times, which stained his clothing with patterns that mocked religious icons. The Warrens' notes, meticulous and chilling, detailed how the demon taunted them personally, revealing private sins in mocking tones that left Lorraine trembling. This demon was speaking directly to the Warrens, as if it knew them, as if it knew every secret that they had ever held, every sin that they had ever committed. This phase of the investigation built an unbearable suspense, each revelation peeling back layers of the entity's malevolence. The historical roots of the haunting emerged as the Warrens delved deeper, uncovering a legacy of darkness tied to the land itself. The farm, it turned out, had allegedly been the site of occult rituals in the 19th century, where a coven of witches had attempted to invoke entities for power, their collective blood spilled in secretive rites that stained the soil forever. Lorraine's visions that she received as she traversed the property revealed a central figure, a warlock whose pact with Satan granted him dominion over the property, his spirit lingering to harvest souls like the devil's reaper. Maurice's family had unknowingly inherited this curse, the demon latching on to him because of his strong will, seeing him as a worthy adversary to corrupt, a perfect vessel for his demonic plans. Wanting to dig even further into the haunting and the history of the property, the Warrens then asked if they could take a look in the house's cracks and crevices, in locations like the attic, the soil around the house, the barn, and the basement. And what they found, according to them, was chilling. As stated in the book Satan's Harvest, quote, "During their first full day at the Theriault farm, Ed and Lorraine Warren, accompanied by Nancy, ventured into the dusty, cobweb-draped attic to search for clues to the entity's origins. Amid the clutter of old trunks and forgotten furniture, they uncovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard, revealing a cache of chilling artifacts. Inside were a pentagram-etched dagger, its blade stained with what appeared to be dried blood, and a stack of yellowed tomes filled with handwritten notes in a mix of French and Latin, detailing satanic rituals and invocations to demonic entities. Lorraine, her clairvoyant senses heightened, felt a surge of black energy emanating from the objects, describing visions of a 19th century warlock performing blood sacrifices on the land to seal a pact with Satan. Ed carefully documented the find, photographing the dagger and transcribing passages from the tomes, which included names of demons and instructions for summoning them, which corroborated Maurice's accounts of the entity's taunts. The artifacts hummed with residual energy, causing the temperature in the attic to drop sharply, and Lorraine noted that the warlock's spirit lingered, tied to the land through these relics. Nancy, standing nearby, wept as she recognized some of the handwriting as resembling her late father-in-law Maxime's, suggesting that he had continued the dark tradition or that Maurice himself had brought these artifacts with him and stowed them in the home himself secretively. The Warrens concluded that these items were physical evidence of the satanic pact that had cursed the Theriault bloodline, serving as a conduit for the demon Zephin's hold on Maurice, and they later used this discovery to prepare for the exorcism, blessing the artifacts to weaken the entity's power. But this discovery pissed off the demon. The entity, sensing the investigation's progress, intensified its attacks, causing Maurice to bang his head against walls until blood matted in his hair. His screams a symphony of agony that echoed into the night. The narrative of the past intertwined with the present, heightening the terror as if the farm's history was reliving itself through Maurice's suffering. As the possession deepened, Maurice's behavior devolved into acts of grotesque violence, both self-inflicted and directed outward. While the Warrens were on property, he would seize knives from the drawer, slashing at his arms with precision that belied his delirium, the wounds healing almost instantly, only to reopen with fresh torment. Nancy soon afterwards found Maurice in the barn, gnawing on raw meat from a slaughtered animal that he had recently killed with his bare hands, his teeth tearing flesh with animalistic fervor, blood dripping from his chin like the tears of the damned. The demon spoke through him, commanding the family to desecrate holy items, and when they refused, invisible forces hurled them across rooms, bruises blooming like dark flowers on their skin. One child, in a moment of bravery, placed a rosary around Maurice's neck, only for it to burn into his flesh, leaving a charred outline that smoked with an unholy incense. Ed Warren, who was in the room at the time and witnessed this event, later stated that he felt the entity's hatred radiate like heat from a furnace, its voice booming towards him as it said,
"I am Legion, and this man is my harvest."
Suddenly, the air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves breathed with malice. The family's faith was tested to its limits, and the Warrens knew that they had to do something. Lorraine's clairvoyant insights provided glimpses into the demon's identity, which seemed to confirm the messages that Maurice had received earlier during his bouts of possession. Lorraine stated that she received a message that the entity attempting to fully possess Maurice was a fallen angel named Zephin, who reveled in the corruption of the pure-hearted. During a vigil held inside the farmhouse, Lorraine entered a trance, her body rigid as the entity revealed its name through Maurice, who levitated fully now in front of everyone present, his form twisting midair into blasphemous poses that mocked the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Blood poured from his mouth in a torrent, forming words on the floor. Satan's harvest. Yes, that was spelled out in blood, in Maurice's blood, on the floor in front of everybody in this group. A prophecy of souls reaped from the farm's cursed earth. The Warrens recorded temperatures plummeting to sub-zero in spots, and even stated that the frost formed intricate patterns of inverted crosses on the windows. Maurice's eyes, when possessed, glowed with an inner fire, pupils dilating to black voids that swallowed light. Nancy, holding vigil, felt claws rake her back in the middle of this process, which left welts on her body that burned like acid, a warning from the infernal intruder. The suspense reached a fever pitch, the entity toying with them, building to the climax of confrontation. The involvement of the Catholic Church added a layer of solemn gravity to the unfolding horror. Bishop Robert McKenna, a veteran exorcist with a face etched by battles against the demonic, arrived to assess the case, after being called in by the Warrens. His presence commanding yet compassionate. Upon his arrival, he interviewed Maurice, who alternated between lucid pleas for help and demonic rants that shook the foundations of the home. The bishop noted the classic signs of possession: superhuman strength, knowledge of hidden things, and profound blasphemy, all hallmarks of the true possession as per church doctrine. During the preliminary rites, Maurice's body arched, stigmata bleeding anew, the room filling with the stench of brimstone as the entity defied the commands. McKenna persisted, his voice steady, invoking saints and angels, but the demon responded with laughter that cracked windows in the home. The family's hope flickered, the ritual a beacon in the darkness, yet the entity fought back against Bishop McKenna and the Warrens, hurling objects in the room directly at the bishop, who dodged them with a grace born of experience. And at this point, it was time for the exorcism.
Nancy, Maurice, Ed and I, and Father Homer Boyer met with Bishop Timothy Harrington at the rectory. And that day, the bishop was so moved by the plight of this man that he hugged him and said, "You are my brother, and I want to help you." And he performed the very first exorcism over him that day. The following Sunday, Maurice and Nancy were going to church. There's steep steps going up to the church. They got to the top step. Maurice somersaulted backwards through the air and down to the pavement, but you didn't get hurt. And the second exorcism was then planned. The third and final exorcism of Maurice was May 2nd of 1985. He was possessed by a demonic spirit, maybe even more than one demonic spirit.
This is called the ritual romano, which is the ultimate in the rites of exorcism where Catholicism is concerned. He prepared himself. He went to the home.
When they were doing the exorcism on him, when he turned his head, I saw his face change. I saw the satanic look on his face.
I see characteristics of his face look like they're becoming all crinkled, like burnt. There's a split on the left side of the head, which widens, opens up. The eyes, he blinks 3 times, which we consider an insult to the Trinity. The eyes look like a serpent. All of a sudden, his eyes rolled up in his head, and his head went down, he collapsed, and within a few minutes, came to. The first thing he asked for was Nancy, his wife.
The exorcism of Maurice Theriault commenced in earnest, a multi-day ordeal that transformed the farmhouse into a fortress of faith amid the storm of demonic pain. Bishop McKenna, flanked by other priests who at this point had been summoned to the farm, including Father Homer Boyer, who was out there the first time, encircled Maurice with circles of blessed salt and crucifixes, their chants rising in Latin cadence that vibrated the air. However, the demon didn't like this, and Maurice thrashed against the restraints that held his body down, his voice a cacophony of tongues, revealing arcane knowledge that stunned the clergy. Objects flew throughout the room with hurricane force, Bibles shredding midair, holy water evaporating into thin air before even being allowed to touch Maurice's skin. Lorraine, present in the room during this exorcism, sensed multiple entities and stated that she believed that Zephin was leading a legion drawn by the farm's cursed legacy. Ed documented each phenomenon with photographs allegedly capturing orbs and ectoplasm that defied science. During the exorcism, Maurice's body contorted, head spinning 180 degrees, vomit of black bile scorching the floor. The bishop commanded departure in Christ's name, the entity screeching denials, walls cracking under pressure. Meanwhile, Nancy and the family's children prayed in another room, their voices a counterpoint to the chaos. The first night of exorcism, though, after all was said and done, ended in a spiritual stalemate, exhaustion claiming all but the demon's vigilance. They would have to wake up the next day and try again. This demon, or these demons, were incredibly powerful, and they would need every ounce of strength that they could muster in order to get it to leave. Subsequent exorcism sessions delved into psychological warfare, with the entity recounting Maurice's life in mocking detail, his own personal sins exaggerated to the point of despair. Bishop McKenna countered these claims by the demon with absolutions, his stole singed but unbroken. Physical manifestations peaked in the room, with Maurice's nails reportedly elongating, according to all that were present, into claws which slashed at the exorcists, one of those slashes striking Father Boyer and drawing blood from his arm. The air ionized, and according to those who were present, lightning flashed indoors without storm, illuminating grotesque faces that surrounded the room in smoke. Lorraine's visions throughout the exorcism showed the warlock's pact, which she believed could be broken only by some form of absolute divine intervention. During the exorcism, Ed restrained Maurice when he began to levitate, his muscles straining against impossible, invisible force. The demon, amidst the chaos, named victims, threatening the children's souls, heightening the stakes. The prayers intensified, candles flaring blue with holy fire, and suspense mounted as the entity seemingly weakened, its voice cracking in fatigue. But another day had ended, and the demon still wasn't gone. Dawn brought temporary peace for all those involved and a moment of rest, but the battle loomed. The final confrontation unfolded on the 3rd day, the house trembling as if in earthquake, the entity's rage peaking in a maelstrom of fury. Maurice foamed, body rigid, eyes all white as the bishop invoked the full rite of exorcism. Blasphemies roared, furniture exploding into splinters that pierced people's skin like shrapnel. Lorraine collapsed from the visions that she was receiving of hell, and was revived with the aid of Ed. The demon confessed to the pact's hold, begging quarter before defiance returned. Bishop McKenna, though unwavering, pressed on, with the holy relics glowing in his hands, the cross on Maurice's chest burning away the inverted mark. A wind howled throughout the house, windows shattering, but suddenly the entity began to falter, its voice weakening, and with a final, brutal, ear-popping, primal scream that echoed throughout the house and echoed across the nearby fields, the demon departed from the home and from Maurice's body, leaving Maurice limp and free, the air clean of sulfur. The family, seeing this, began to hysterically weep in relief, the farm stilling and feeling pure for the first time in months. Victory against evil had come, but the scars remained eternal. But before we get to the final disturbing chapter of this story, I have something to show you that might pique your interest. The footage that I'm about to play you is an unedited, to my knowledge, clip of Maurice Theriault's exorcism, recorded during just one small portion of the 3-day process in the presence of Ed Lorraine Warren, Bishop McKenna, and the others. The following footage is incredibly disturbing, and viewer discretion is advised. What you're about to see is truly unlike anything I've ever seen before.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's in the light. Watch, lift up, really good. Lift up the front. See it up in the shoulder? Yeah. Move, yeah, you're in the way, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, how about the front? Maurice, right underneath your chest, Maurice. That's back right there. No, it's a cross mark. It's a cross. That's a cross. Look at this one, Father. Wait a minute. Maurice? Oh, that's a definite cross. Where's the cross? Point it out to me, Maurice. I want to make sure I have the right one. Right there, right? Did that just show up for you? Did that just show up? Yes, it did. I just looked at it only one light. I was too. Yeah. It was just one like this and this too. Can you turn around and get here? Is that right over here? Is that right over here?
This is the exorcism part right here. You'll see the spittle come out of his mouth.
But no base in those yards, they were garments out in those. But as around any country on those that is trading yards, they were garments out in those. But if they jump around, talk and raise away from the garden yards, they were garments out in those. But down on the upper story, soon, that I'm made to say the attic corridor and made and stomping the on a country garden yards, they were garments out in those. But in the Miko Sante, say the human garden yards, they were garments out in those. But there is a century because the granite falls in the ground and pouring under night and you're still down the body night. And some sort of things don't fall at all. Would you clock something? But then it's a Sunday, Tuesday, Tuesday, you're still down the body night. But there is a century because the granite falls in the ground and pouring under night and you're still down the night. Audinos and Punto Foco, Cristiano Park, and Ebony Cotton, Nigeria, Senora Settled on the Audinos. I don't measure on days at any part in the city, they will call it. In Seville, in the Grossos at a base, Ivan Giri, even when City trading your Settled on the Audinos. The north and the south into a town, so that we still completely consider in your Settled on the Audinos. The Montes not that I should have seen a day today at Oregon, Settled on the North. Audinos, the only best benefit for it is not just undiscernible and figure out the garment audinos. The dying lost not that far, soon so conformed, the benefit form and so on of it. Then I don't not see any of the civil garment audinos. The purpose carried by a considered in your civil garment audinos. It only listed it sometimes the suit of very uncomfortable. Buddhaman is society of Buddhamanera Divani. The gain in testimony to the zero freedom lay on the greater and third film. Under a look at his testimony to the zero freedom. There are the zero of the unhumbling and living in humbling. Under the other ministers on the death and minister non to notice. And both the gain is to the gain of non-living time. So for all make the ground the end of the day, for the child into the day, these two thirds and down the eight. The non-instant universe needs a voluntary tonic and a voluntary theory that is still not in sense. The power of us, the public power of others, the ignorance lying here, Ryan causing eternity of past, very plain and drastic, very toxic. The end of the art. We will share upon your name, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, in the name of the Blessed Virgin. We will share upon your name. Speak. How did you enter, Maurice? Is this God? Vexio Santi Vangeli Se Kundamatam. In our temporary figures, it should receive into the Mandam Universum Predicati Evangelium Omnipresere. These ready to live about these artists who live solving terror. These are all non-created to the Condamnabitra. Signa Autem Eos, who they created to annotate the Conjuring. Nomineo Demonia Egyptian. Inverse of Contra Novus, the Conte Colin. The Mortis non creativent non eos and Catus. Very good manus component at they may have a one. Maurice, do you feel anything inside you? Maurice? Maurice is a spirit. This is the man in form. Spirit of the Monday. Who says? Who? Clay. Who's that man in form? When did you enter?
As people have noted about that footage, there are some very, very eerie things that can be seen. Maurice's skin seems to crack and heal itself. His skin seems to bubble at times. His eyes just have this look and they kind of shift and expand and contract. You can hear the voices, you can see the process of the exorcism. And if you do believe in exorcisms, this is one of the most infamous videos, full recordings of at least a portion of an exorcism procedure ever recorded. It's, to me, absolutely crazy and deeply frightening footage. But that was the end. And according to all involved, at that point, the demon had left Maurice's family. The demon had left Maurice's body. It had left the family alone. The curse had been broken. And in the aftermath of the exorcism, the Theriault family slowly reclaimed peace, though echoes of the horror lingered like ghosts in the corners of all rooms. Maurice recovered gradually, his body healing from wounds both seen and unseen, his faith in God renewed, but also tempered by the trauma. Nancy and the children returned to their daily routines, and after a while, life really seemed to be going back to normal. But every now and again, when the sun would set and the moon would emerge, flashbacks would return, prayers now becoming fervent necessities for the family to ward away the evil. The Warrens, before leaving the property, advised that the family maintain an ongoing vigilance against evil spirits, and they placed religious relics throughout the home as wards against evil. As a final act of cleansing, Bishop McKenna blessed the land and scattered salt across the land to purify the cursed soil. Animals repopulated the barn, milk flowing pure once more, and night after night, the place felt more and more like it was finally returning to normal. Whispers of possession flared and faded throughout the nearby community of Warren, though wary glances persisted. Maurice and his family attended their weekly Catholic masses with deeper gratitude, the possession a testimony, a personal testimony, to their own experience with the divine power. And the story spread, a warning to all of darkness's reach. Yet, the harvest of Satan had been thwarted, souls saved from the Reaper. That's the happy ending that was printed in the original 1985 version of the novel Satan's Harvest, which I drew almost all of the research for this video from. Pretty much every detail that you heard in this video comes directly from the original text of Satan's Harvest, which was written by Ed Lorraine Warren, another author, a ghostwriter, Maurice Theriault, and others who contributed to the book. So that's what happened at the end of the original book. The family returned to normal, all was happy again. After the book was published in 1985, though, the case was thrust into the national spotlight. People literally couldn't believe what they were reading. And the book, co-authored by Maurice Theriault himself and the Warrens and others, served as an extremely detailed and supposedly thorough written documentation of a case that, according to some, was of verified demonic possession. There are also, though, some details that were left out of the book that really need to be included here that could give us some context. You see, in the year 1976, before the alleged demonic possession took hold of him, Maurice Theriault pled guilty to multiple counts of. That's right, Maurice was sentenced to 5 years probation after pleading guilty, which is to me horrific that he didn't even serve any time in prison for the multiple counts of. But this would have made him, at the time of the exorcism and all of these events, a convicted. Now, based on my own research, details are pretty sparse online, but I believe that he was sentenced for the of his own children. But I'd have to find more details on that to be able to say that for certain, and details are lacking. That's technically hearsay, but I've seen a lot of people say that online. Clearly, as we can see with that troubling detail, Maurice was an incredibly messed up individual, but that detail seems to have been omitted from the first version of the book, Satan's Harvest. I wonder why. Then, in the year 1982, and this is an interesting key point of the book that I haven't really talked about yet, before the possession allegedly took hold of Maurice, his father, Maxime, the one who allegedly forced Maurice to join him in that ritual, his father, Maxime, killed Maurice's mother, and then with a shotgun. Some viewed this as an act of demonic possession, karma coming to Maxime, like he was driven to complete this devious act by some sort of otherworldly demonic force, especially when you take Maurice's testimony into consideration. However, others obviously viewed this as nothing more than a domestic violence situation that was unfortunately taken to the extreme. Regardless, it was in the year or so after this event that Maurice really began to report experiencing the symptoms and signs of the possession. Keep in mind, the Warrens, according to their testimony, found what looked to be Maxime's handwriting in the attic of the Theriault farmhouse in the middle of Maurice's possession. There's also that spirit of the warlock, which was bound to the land, bound to Maurice. Some people have theorized that, if that's true, could have been his own father, who had finally completed some sort of ritual or was driven to madness, had taken the life of his wife and his own, and had then moved on to attempt to take the lives of his other family members as well. But then, in the year 1985, in the midst of this possession and exorcism, Maurice is charged with something disturbing. He's charged again with the children, and this time he pleads guilty. But he cites that demonic possession made him do it. The district attorney at the time reportedly dropped the charges against Maurice due to the insanity of the claims being made of possession and the devil made me do it, and not wanting to litigate through them, and also, according to what I could find online, because the victim would not testify. Apparently, and keep in mind, this is just from what I could find on the internet, Maurice had routinely his stepdaughter from a previous marriage, another young child, for years. So, regardless if it's paranormal, demonic, or just psychological, it seemed as though Maurice himself had some dark skeletons hidden deep within his closet. Skeletons that I'm assuming, if it was real, the demonic entity would have brought to light throughout the attempted possession as a way to harm himself or the family, if you believe in the demonic possession angle. Keep in mind that throughout the book, they reference vaguely that this thing was bringing up Maurice's past, and it was attempting to traumatize Nancy and the children, and it was using Maurice's past indiscretions and his crimes, or whatever they referred to it as, against him, trying to make the family hate him and create this negativity and evil throughout the family home. It doesn't necessarily specifically discuss those things in the book, but I'm assuming that that could be what it was talking about if you believe in that. Then, in the year 1991, years after the exorcisms, Maurice's wife, Nancy, curiously took out a restraining order against Maurice. Apparently, he had been acting increasingly strange, controlling, and the violent tendencies had taken over once again. Nancy was scared for her own safety and for the safety of her children, and so she had taken the step to sever the tie between she and her ex-husband once and for all. But the biggest twist of all came in the year 1992. On November 4th, 1992, an article in a local newspaper surfaced containing some disturbing and incredibly, deeply troubling information. The article read as follows. A local farmer who co-authored a popular book on the occult in the 1980s and claimed to be possessed by the devil, shot and after wounding his estranged wife at their home in western Massachusetts, police said Wednesday. Maurice Theriault was found dead of a bullet wound to the head at the rented house in Whately Tuesday night after his wife Nancy staggered out of the door and collapsed onto a neighbor's front steps. She was taken to Bay State Medical Center in Springfield, where she was reported in fair condition Wednesday with bullet wounds to her left arm and side. Theriault, in his 50s, was co-author of Satan's Harvest, a book on the occult published in 1985 in which he claimed to be possessed by the devil. The work attracted wide attention among devil worship enthusiasts at the time, and Theriault made several national television appearances promoting the book. Neighbors said Theriault had moved out of the house in recent months and that his wife had recently filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order to keep her husband away. So, that's right. At the end of the story, Maurice, just like his father had done a decade prior to the year, I don't know the exact date, week, or month that Maurice's father did that to himself and his wife, Maurice's mom, but 10 years after his father had committed almost the exact same crime, Maurice, just like his father, attempted to murder his wife, although Maurice, unlike his dad, was unsuccessful in his actions. And then afterwards, just like his father. So, was this tragedy history repeating itself? Was the dark energy still haunting Maurice? Or was he just a deeply troubled man with intense mental health issues and a disturbing set of proclivities?
I know that my grandfather took my grandmother to Oklahoma for a vacation, and my mom had to call me. I was at school, and he had shot her, actually tried to shoot her twice. The first bullet missed. He shot her in the head, and then he...
Why are you scary? I had many scary moments.
What do you mean?
There was times when he got mean and he got that look on his face that he would go after my daughters or hit them or smack them, but most of it was done behind my back.
You're getting upset. What's upsetting you now? Do you want us to stop for a while?
No. What happened to my children? What they went through during this. What we all went through.
Why didn't you pick up and leave?
Because there was too many threats. And we threatened that if we did go, that... And we never even told the Warrens that anything was ever said, or if the kids ever talked about anything, that the children was going to try to, my children were going to try to break us up and he'd kill one of them, or something would happen to one of them. Things seemed to be going good. In fact, he wasn't even as mean as he used to be. He was easygoing. He was easygoing and everything.
But about a year ago, Ed Warren received an ominous call from Nancy.
And she said, Ed, I have to speak with you. And she said, Maurice is going back into his old ways again. Blood is coming out of his eyes. He's doing things that he shouldn't be doing. He's threatening people.
He came to my house. My stepmother and him, my father, had gotten into an argument, and she had to get a restraining order on him. He came to the house. He said, I want you to have one last shot with me. And I'm like, I don't drink. What are you talking about? And just the demeanor on his face. And he never kissed me. He wasn't a huggable person. He didn't show love. But he was this day. I'm like, this is not him. And so at that point, I'm like, Maureen, I told my older sister, Maureen, the one that was there with me, I said, come with me. We've got to go there. We got to stop. I was like, I could see two bodies. I felt this was going to happen because my father always said he was going to go the same way his father and mother did. Always said that. But my father had this well plotted. I knew that my stepmother was at bingo. Well, I get in my truck and I take my sister with me, and we go to the house to write Nancy a letter to let her know we stopped by. I want to prove to my sister that, yeah, my father's here. Well, at that point, we get into the house, and there's no car in the driveway. And as we walked into the house, she started to write the letter, and I heard a pounding coming up from the basement. And it was footprints, and I heard it, and I knew it wasn't the dog. And then it busted open, and I had a double-barrel shotgun pointed at my face. My father thought that I was Nancy, which was his wife. And he said, calm down, calm down. I went to grab the phone to call 911. He had already cut the phone lines. He had a truck parked a mile behind the house, so nobody would even think he was there. You wouldn't know that he was there. There was no visible sign. There's no police station in Whately. I got him to sit down on the couch and try to talk and reason with him to calm down, praying that Nancy would not come home. He said some apologies about not being, the dad he should have been, and, that this is what he has to do. And I kept telling him, no, this is not the way to do things. This is not. And Nancy drove in the driveway, and he got up in a rage. She came through the door, and my father said, we need to talk. And he said to her, I want to talk to you. And she started swearing, no, I don't want to talk to you. And she said, get the F out of my house. And with that, he shot her in the arm. Then he drug her back in the house, and I'm trying to help her make sure she's okay. And the next thing you know, he said to me, I love you. He yelled at his wife and said, look at me and remember this. And he said to me, forgive me, I love you. And he pulled the trigger, and he's left me with a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of scars.
It's like he's fighting with somebody. He's going to put the gun in his mouth. He's not going to put the gun in his mouth. And I just sat there. Finally, he pulled it. His head goes back, his head goes up, his body goes back. And the only thing that I could say when he did it was amen.
He aimed the gun at her, but suddenly the good part of Maurice somehow overtook him. He looked at her, he could have killed her right there, but he didn't. So I see where good had taken over evil.
He started to come toward me with a gun, and I had my hands on the gun with him, fighting with him. He swung and he hit me with the butt of the gun. I don't know what gave me the strength to keep going, the adrenaline or what it was. And when I got as far as the road, I heard a bang and a crash. And they told me that he had shot through the window in the living room. He says, you're going to remember this. And he sits down on the other sofa in front of me, which was I'd say about 5 feet away, trying to put the gun. And he's going this way with the gun. It's like he's fighting with somebody. Finally, he got the gun. His head goes back, his head goes up, his body goes back. And the only thing that I could say when he did it was amen. That's the only thing I said, amen. That's the only word that would come out of my mouth. And the only other word that I said when he was pounding on me is I said, oh God, oh God. And he kept pounding me in the head, and I can remember him saying, yes, oh God. And those are the only words I said after I had the scuffle with him, after he hit me. I was, oh God. And then when I said, amen. I ran up the road, and I'm screaming and yelling for help. I get up to the house on the right, and I go to the house, and I'm screaming and yelling, help me, help me, help me. When I looked up, I saw my landlord, which lived in a house further up from me. He was there and said, Nancy, keep talking, Nancy, keep talking. And then I started talking about the grandchildren. I was saying my prayers. I haven't had one dream about that man since this happened. I'm sorry that he had to die. I mean, I didn't want him to die. All I wanted to do was leave me alone. But I'm glad he's gone. I'm glad he's gone.
Obviously, while the Theriault case has been presented as a genuine case of demonic possession many times over throughout the history of paranormal inquiry, skeptics have long questioned its legitimacy and have attributed the events to various psychological factors, hoaxes, or misinterpretation rather than supernatural intervention. Critics, including members of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, or CSI, argue that Maurice's symptoms, such as convulsions, speaking in tongues, and stigmata, mirror those of dissociative identity disorder or temporal lobe epilepsy, conditions that can produce hallucinations, superhuman strength via adrenaline surges, and self-inflicted wounds without conscious awareness. Investigations by rationalist groups like the James Randi Educational Foundation have pointed out the lack of independent scientific verification, noting that Ed Lorraine Warren's involvement often relied on anecdotal testimony and subjective clairvoyant claims, with no controlled studies or medical exams during the peak events to rule out any natural causes. Furthermore, the historical occult rituals on the farm that Lorraine Warren along with Maurice supposedly were receiving visions and information about lack documented evidence beyond Lorraine Warren's visions and the discovery of those items in the attic, which skeptics dismiss as cold reading or confirmation bias, suggesting that the narrative may have been embellished for the book to fit a sensational horror trope. Figures like Joe Nickell, a prominent skeptic, have analyzed similar cases and concluded that poltergeist activity often stems from psychokinesis fraud or environmental factors such as drafts causing object movement, and that the blood from eyes could be a hysterical conversion symptom or a deliberate action done by Maurice. Online forums and articles from sources like Snopes and Wikipedia highlight the Warrens' history of controversial claims, including some debunked elements that exist in stories like the Amityville Horror, which to some cast doubt on the couple's credibility and imply that the Theriault story was nothing more than a product of 1980s satanic panic hysteria, amplified by media sensationalism. Despite eyewitness accounts from Police Chief Sean LaBouffe and the other priests involved in the case, along with both Ed and Lorraine Warren, Nancy Theriault before her eventual passing, and the Theriault children, skeptics note that no video or photographic proof exists beyond the Warrens' own archives, which are almost completely publicly inaccessible, aside from some recordings of the exorcism, and that they suggest group delusion or suggestibility played a role in the family's perceptions.
There are many skeptics to Maurice's claim. Sylvia Buck, a longtime citizen of the town of Warren with a great interest in local history, is disgusted by what she says is the false notoriety her town has received due to Maurice's actions. She claims, along with Maurice's younger sister, that there were perfectly natural explanations for what Frenchie endured, and that some so-called unexplainable events were his own fault.
The house had fallen into disrepair during Theriault's residence there, and I was told that there was a fire because he'd overloaded extension cords. And we've heard of that before. That's not unusual, but it isn't the devil doing it. It's just poor judgment on somebody who needs to have the upgrade in the house wiring and not take chances like that. His claim that he could lift his tractor with the fingertip was explained by the fact it was counterbalanced by a load of rocks on the other side. You know, it's just, he's an actor, a bad actor.
Ultimately, while believers in this story see a divine sense of victory against evil, rationalists and skeptics view it as a tragic case of untreated mental illness that was exploited for profit, urging psychological evaluation over exorcism. The skeptical perspective extends to the broader cultural context, where the 1980s saw a surge in reported possessions, coinciding with moral panics over heavy metal music, role-playing games, and alleged satanic cults. Now, I've talked at length about my views on the satanic panic, which elements I believe were bogus, and which elements I believe never got talked about enough that were indeed very, very real, but I'll save that for another video. In the Theriault instance, skeptics point to Maurice's rural isolation and stress from losses on the farm as potentially being triggers for mass psychogenic illness, with the strange language that he was speaking possibly just being glossolalia from charismatic influences or simple gibberish misinterpreted as Latin. Medical experts, such as those cited in The Demon-Haunted World by Carl Sagan, explain aversion to holy objects as psychosomatic responses conditioned by previous belief, not some sort of supernatural allergy, and levitations as nothing more than exaggerated muscle spasms or hidden wires hidden in these homes. Forums on Reddit's r/skeptic and articles from Skeptical Inquirer magazine dissected the book Satan's Harvest in the past and criticized its reliance on unverified personal accounts and the Warrens' own financial incentive from book deals and lectures. Bishop McKenna's involvement, while lending ecclesiastical weight, is countered by the Catholic Church's own cautious stance on possessions, which require medical clearance first, which skeptics claim was bypassed here. Overall, the case exemplifies to some how fear and faith can conjure demons not in the outside world but in one's mind, with no empirical proof seen to elevate it beyond folklore. serving as a cautionary tale against superstition in vulnerable communities. There was also this article, published in the Washington Times in 1992 after Maurice's death and the attempted murder of Nancy, which read, Maurice Theriault claimed he was possessed by demons that drove him to repeat the crime of his father, who murdered his mother and the claims strained credibility, yet Theriault came close to fulfilling them last week. Whether from a tormented mind or tortured soul, he chased his wife into the street, wounded her, then as his father did 10 years before. I can't say it's totally unexpected because this man was either seriously disturbed or possessed. Take your pick, said Michael LaSalandra, a journalist who co-wrote a 1990 book about Theriault called Satan's Harvest. I don't think he was a con man. I think he sincerely believed he was possessed, he said, and many who knew Theriault agreed. Roman Catholic priests on 2 occasions performed special blessings on Theriault. A bishop from the traditional Roman Catholic Church, a breakaway sect, carried out exorcisms on him 8 years ago and earlier this year. The church believed that the devil had taken over, said Homer Boyer, the Roman Catholic priest who retired in 1990 from Theriault's parish of St. Paul's Church in Warren, about 20 miles east of Springfield. His sister, Dana Davio of Springfield, disagrees. Maurice was not possessed. Maurice was an actor, she said. She said he was obsessed with the occult. Few aspects of Theriault's life seem beyond debate, except that he was very troubled. Theriault was the oldest of 15 children in a French-Canadian family. He remembered his father as a malevolent figure who pulled him from school in the 3rd grade and sometimes abused him. Theriault eventually moved to Warren. He farmed vegetables and sold them at a stand. People called him Frenchie. Friends and acquaintances described Theriault variously as a devout Catholic, an ordinary Joe, and the kindest, gentlest man you'd ever want to meet. Yet family, work, and church apparently could not chase away the horror of the secret, the 1982 murder of Theriault's parents, Maxime and Emila, in Choctaw, Oklahoma. On Tuesday night, it haunted him for the last time. Theriault, who was 56 and separated from his wife in October, returned home with a 12-gauge shotgun, said State Police Sergeant Leonard von Flattern. His wife was away. He cut the telephone line and waited. When she came back, he chased her into the street and shot her in the arm. He dragged her back inside and Mr. LaSalandra, a former reporter for the Boston Herald who works for the Palm Beach Post in Florida, said he has viewed a videotape of Theriault's exorcism. I saw things that were very hard to explain, he said. He said the tape shows Theriault bleeding from the eyes, his face distorted and flat, with cracks in his forehead. But his sister said she once saw Theriault put blood under his eyelid and cut crosses into his skin with a nail. She said he spoke a version of French and Pig Latin to make people think he was speaking Latin backwards. Robert Baker, a retired psychology professor who has written on purported cases of possession, said people often hide guilt behind claims of demons. In other words, you're not responsible for your ideas and actions. Someone else is. Theriault apparently had plenty of reasons to feel guilty and depressed. He pleaded guilty to in 1976 and served 5 years probation. In 1985, he was again charged with but the charge was dropped when Theriault confessed and blamed his demons. Commenters on Reddit have also echoed similar statements, with one person commenting, "This is a guy with a prior history of who started claiming he was possessed just prior to him being charged with his stepdaughter. Not hard to figure out that he had a strong motive for faking it." Another commenter stated, "But when he found himself alone with his family, Maurice suddenly became evil. He explained his behavior by saying that he was inhabited by an evil spirit which pushed him to violence. Interesting excuse for being an abusive piece of shit." But I do want to point out something interesting that was found in that somewhat skeptical article that I just read you, and I'll leave you on that point. The article mentions that an exorcism had been performed on Maurice earlier that year in 1992. I couldn't really find any other mention of this online, but there, in the article, you have a priest himself admitting to this. Clearly, this was done away from the spotlight after the book had been published, after the shows had been produced, and after the story had been widely covered. So what does that leave us with? Was Maurice at the time struggling again with what he thought were demonic forces? Did the entity or energy come back to him, this time to fully and finally claim dominion over his body and his soul? Did he possibly to prevent him from causing more harm to those he loved? Or was Maurice Theriault just a psychotic who blamed demons for the suffering and pain that he put onto others? Demons and demonic possession being an easy scapegoat for his problems, instead of taking responsibility for any of them. Some are going to agree with that final statement, others won't. It is interesting to me, though, that Maurice was once again seeking out help from the church during the year that he died. 7 years after his supposed final exorcism, for he may have believed that the demon had come back for him. It's a curious little detail and an extremely troubling and frankly very, very disturbing story. That is, if it's all true. So, what are my thoughts? I don't know. I read this book when I was in like 8th grade, and it's one of the things that really got me into paranormal activity. And I mean, I went on ghost tours when I was a kid, and it was like this whole thing that my parents and I did all the time. So I've always been into the paranormal, but I read all of the Warrens' books, and I've always thought they're, regardless if you believe in them or not, they're very, very well written, and they're very frightening books. Now, when it comes to Maurice's case, I think that what it really boils down to is, do you believe in spiritual possession or do you not? Now, I'm not saying I believe 100% in everything that was claimed to have happened in this story itself, but I do find it very interesting that it's not just the family and the Warrens in this case that have had these experiences. There were multiple ecclesiastical figures, like multiple priests, bishops, who saw these things like smoke rising from Maurice's body and him bleeding, and they heard the voices. And according to the exorcism story, all of those priests and the people involved were seeing him levitate and his body convulsing and lightning inside of the room, faces in the walls. The children said that this was all legit. So did Nancy. I've never seen any information that said that they later on came back and said that this was all bullshit. I would imagine that if it really was true and nothing like this had ever actually happened to the family after what happened to Nancy when Maurice attempted to kill her, and then I would imagine that she would have come out and said, yeah, this was all just made up and he's just a psychopath. But curiously, she didn't. And then you've got the official police report generated, the officers that saw Maurice turn his guns in and testified to that happening. And if you read the original police report, it's very, very interesting. But I don't know. I tend myself to believe in these stories. I lived in a haunted house that was very, very actively haunted. And it was a situation where it was haunting the family and not the house. It was a brand new house we moved into. I've talked about this many times before. And what we experienced was beyond the realm of Casper, where you're hearing knocks on the walls or something. It was like guttural, terrifying activity that was occurring for months and months and months that never truly went away. Still, in this house that I'm in now, that Courtney and I moved into last year, just this week, creepily enough, we heard what sounded like someone walking around in our attic one night. I'm not used to having an attic because I live in Texas, and I know it could be an animal, blah, blah. It's not, though. It's like footsteps, like heavy footsteps we heard walking up and down. So those footsteps were really loud. So the other day, Courtney and I decided to go up to the attic because it's almost Halloween. So we have all of our decorations stored up there. So Courtney made me go up there and get the boxes down, and I was kind of handing them to her as I was going down the stairs. And at one point, Courtney came up into the attic, and there's like 3 light bulbs that go to the end of the attic. And the moment that she came up, 2 of them turned off at the very end of the attic. So it was very creepy because it created this kind of illusion where this is lit up right here next to you, and then the further back you look down the attic, it's just like shadowy, inky, pitch black, like no light source whatsoever, like a black void. And she commented and said like, what the hell, like that's really creepy. And I'm like, oh, we just heard those noises up there the other day. That is really creepy. Oh yeah. And then Courtney the other day woke up. This is very important. After hearing those noises in the attic, Courtney woke up and she told me this. Keep in mind, this isn't for a video. This is just what's happening in our lives. In the morning, when I got up from bed, she's like, I did not sleep at all last night. It was so scary. And I'm like, what happened? Because I'm a pretty heavy sleeper. And she said that in the middle of the night, she woke up and both of our dogs, Kai and Elfie, who sleep with us in our bed, were staring at the doorway of our bedroom, which the attic entrance is right outside of the doorway. It's literally like 2 feet from there. And she said they were both kind of whining and squeaking. And then she said that I turned over to Courtney and said, oh, is that the ghost with the horn standing there? And that to me is creepy. That literally just happened. And so that happened. We heard the noises. The light bulbs burn out in the attic. And then just yesterday we had some AC repair guys come over because something went wrong with our air conditioning unit in the attic. And they went up there, and I was downstairs editing, and I actually heard them say out loud, like, dude, did that light just flicker by itself? And I was like, no way. So then when they came down afterwards, I was like, hey, I just want to let you guys know, we just heard these footsteps. And they were like, yeah, the light in the back of the attic came on and then turned off by itself. So I don't know. I know that this stuff is real and that it happens. I've experienced tons off camera, so I don't need to convince people. I know you guys know my perspective and my thoughts, but I always thought that this story was specifically incredibly interesting. I believe that there was definitely some sort of paranormal element here. I don't want to ever excuse anyone's horrific actions. Obviously, when it comes to harming children, attempting to kill someone, I don't ever want to blame that on any sort of demonic possession or anything like that. And I think that's just something that Maurice didn't want to admit to or confess to in his life while he was alive. And it kind of ended like it did. But yeah, interestingly, there is a reference to Maurice in the Conjuring films. They don't actually reference, I don't believe, this possession case, but there is a character in the Nun films whose name is Maurice, and they call him Frenchie, which I just thought was crazy, that there are all these little things in the Conjuring universe, all of these films, that are like references to Ed Lorraine Warren cases that you would only know if you read the books or really studied all this stuff. So when they said, oh, Maurice, call me Frenchie, I was like, oh my God, Satan's Harvest, that's crazy. That's just another reference. But anyways, y'all, please let me know what case you'd like to see me cover next. I know that a lot of people have said Amityville Horror, which I would really like to do because there's so much there that is correct and so much that is wrong about that case, but it's compelling, very compelling nonetheless. And I know this has been an extremely long video, so thank you guys for sticking around. I'm Colin Browen. I will see you guys next time. Thanks for listening, and stay spooky.